These seeds yield a harvest in 18 days. The old man looks at him as if he were a liar, because even the fastest growing radishes take 2 months to mature. Yet the stranger is already kneeling in the barren soil, sowing the dying village's last hope. 18 days. Or is he just another mouse to feed? But let's go back. Daniel Rowe woke up face down in the dirt. Not from pain, not from the cold. Dirt had filled his mouth and clogged his nostrils. He rolled onto his back and coughed up a lump of gray dust. He sat up. His eyes were watering. A field lay before him. A strange field. Gray, not yellow and not green. Gray, as if someone had dumped tons of ash and walked away. He rubs the nearest ear of grain between his fingers. Dust. Dead, empty dust. Spores remain on his fingertips. He brings them to his nose. It smells sweet and rotten at the same time. Fungus. Systemic. It spreads through the plant's vessels. He's seen this in lab samples, but never in a field, and never on this scale. The field stretches to the horizon, and everything is dead. Daniel stands up. His knees are shaking. His head is buzzing. He doesn't remember how he ended up here. The last thing he remembers is the headlights of an oncoming truck and the sound of a crash, and then dirt in his mouth. He looks around. No road, no pickup truck, no asphalt. Just a gray field and a low sky the color of old tin. And a backpack 2 steps away. And next to it, a cardboard box, the very one with the samples from the working greenhouse. Daniel drops to his knees in front of it and flips open the lid. 42 bags, all intact, all labeled in his handwriting. Zarya 7 tomato, Cascade 12 wheat, Idaho Reserve potato, Skorospelka 18 radish. He slams the box shut and presses it to his chest. His hands are shaking. He doesn't understand where he is or how he got here, but he knows one thing for sure. The soil beneath his feet is acidic, around 5.5 on the pH scale. Poor, exhausted, 10 years without lime, and a fungus is growing on it that kills all living things. Movement on the road. Daniel looks up. 100 meters down the dirt path, 2 people are walking. A boy of about 10 in a knee-length canvas shirt is dragging a woman by the hand. Both are thin, not just thin, starving. The kind of thinness where the skin pulls tight over the cheekbones and the eyes become too big for the face. They freeze and stare. The boy holds out a stick. The woman presses her hand to her stomach. Daniel slowly raises his palms. He doesn't know their language. He doesn't even know where he is. But the boy suddenly says something, and Daniel understands every word. The boy asks who he is and where he fell from. Daniel opens his mouth and finds he can answer. The words come out on their own. He says he came from far away and got lost. The boy doesn't lower his stick. The woman stares intently at the box. Daniel asks if there's a village nearby. The boy nods and pokes with his stick toward the hill. The village is called Homegrave. There is no food there, and if the stranger has come to rob them, he should leave because there is nothing to rob. Daniel looks at the boy, then at the gray field, then at the box in his hands. He says he has no intention of looting. He wants to see their field. The boy glances at his mother. She is silent. Then she nods almost imperceptibly. The 3 of them walk along the path. Daniel carries the box with both hands, as if it were a child. The boy walks ahead and looks back every 5 steps. The woman limps along behind, silent. Over the hill, Homegrave comes into view. 24 houses, shingle roofs, crooked fences. 3 old men sit by the well. They don't speak. They just stare at the ground. In the middle of the village, a house slightly larger than the others. A man in his 60s comes out of it. Gray-haired, thin, his back is straight as a pole. The boy runs up and chatters away. He pokes at Daniel. He pokes at the box. The old man listens in silence. Then he approaches. His name is Oren, the village elder of Homegrave. He asks who Daniel is and why he wants their field. Daniel looks him in the eye. You can't fool him. His eyes are hard. His jaw is clenched. 3 years of famine have made his face look like bark. Daniel tells the truth. Not all of it, just the part that matters. He knows the land. He can tell what's wrong with it. He can help. Oren is silent for a long time. Then he asks where he's from far away. What's in the box? Seeds. Oren's face twitches, just a little, as if he'd been slapped on the cheek from the inside. He says seeds are more valuable than silver these days, that people are killed for a sack of rye, that 3 weeks ago Baron Grace's detachment passed through the village and ransacked the last of the grain from the barn. Daniel nods. He can see it in the faces of the old men by the well, in the boy's ribs showing through his shirt, in the woman's empty eyes. He asks for one thing: half a day and permission to survey the field by the river. Oren looks at him for another minute. Then he turns and walks toward the outskirts. Daniel follows him. The field by the river is the last one. 3 acres. Oren had saved it for a worst-case scenario. The soil here is slightly better. The river water provides a minimum of moisture. But a gray film is already creeping in from the edge. The spores are reaching here, too. Daniel drops to his knees. He scoops up a handful of soil and rubs it between his palms. He sniffs it. He tries it on his tongue. Oren looks at him as if he were mad. Daniel walks across the field, step by step. He stares intently at the weeds. Sorrel, so it's acidic. Wood sorrel by the bank. It's more neutral there. Lamb's quarters on the eastern edge. It's slightly more alkaline there. He maps it out in his head. An hour later, he knows this field better than Oren has in 30 years. He returns to the village elder. Oren is standing in the same spot. He hasn't moved. Daniel says the field can be saved. The soil is acidic and needs ash. There's ash in every stove in the village. We'll collect the ash. We'll spread it in the right places. In a week, the acidity will drop. Oren listens. Then he asks, and then what? And then we'll sow. Oren smirks, bitterly. He says there's nothing to sow. Daniel flips open the lid of the box. He pulls out a single packet, the smallest one. Radish Skorospechka 18. He hands it to Oren. These seeds yield a harvest in 18 days. Oren looks at him like he's a liar. He says the fastest growing radishes take 2 months. That 18 days is nonsense. That seeds like that don't exist. Daniel doesn't argue. He says, give me half a day and 10 kids. There are children in the village. They have nothing else to do anyway. An hour later, 10 kids, aged 7 to 12, are standing by the field. All skinny. All with huge eyes. Daniel explains. Carry ash from the stoves. Sprinkle it where he points. No more, no less. The kids listen in silence. Then they spring into action. They work hard until evening. Daniel marks out the field with sticks in a grid. Each square gets its dose of ash. Where there's more sorrel. Where there's less chickweed. Where there's no lamb's quarters. By sunset, the field is ready. Daniel opens the packet. The seeds are tiny, round, dark red. He sows them in rows, on his knees, with his hands, each seed in its own hole. Oren stands nearby and says nothing. Daniel shows him how to water, not from above, into the furrow. The water goes to the roots, not the leaves. Oren nods. He still doesn't believe it. But he saw how the stranger worked. He saw that this man knows the earth with his hands, not with words. That's enough not to drive him away. They give Daniel a shed on the edge of the village. He collapses onto the straw and stares at the ceiling. The box is nearby. 41 packets. One is already in the ground. You can't get back every seed you've sown. No magic system, no recharging. A finite resource. He closes his eyes. Someone is coughing behind the wall, quiet and long. That's how you cough from hunger, not a cold. Daniel rolls onto his side. One thought spins in his head. 18 days. In 18 days, he'll find out if his seeds work in this world. If they do, he has a chance. If not, he's just another hungry mouth in a dying village. He falls asleep. He dreams of nothing. The first 3 days were the longest of his life. Daniel would come to the field at dawn and leave at dusk. He crouched between the rows and stared at the ground. Just stared. Nothing happened. The soil was damp and dark with ash, but not a single sprout. Oren walked by every morning and asked nothing. That was worse than any question. The elder's silence spoke louder than words. He waited. And every day of that waiting gave Daniel a crumb of hope. The boy with the stick turned out to be Oren's grandson. His name was Finn. He came to the field every day and sat on a rock by the river. In silence, too. On the 4th day, Daniel came to the field and saw green. Tiny sprouts, pale, as thin as threads, but alive. Green against the gray. He knelt down and stared at them for a long time. Then he turned around. Finn was sitting on his rock. His eyes were wide. He saw the same thing. Green. For the first time in 3 years in this village, something green had broken through the earth. Finn leapt off the rock and ran into the village. 20 minutes later, everyone was standing by the field. 23 people, all that remained of Holmgrave. They stood and looked at the thin green threads sticking out of the ground in rows. No one said a word. One old woman slowly knelt down and reached out her hand, but didn't touch them. She just held her palm over the sprouts. Oren walked over to Daniel. He looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded, once, briefly. It was the first day Daniel was given food from the communal pot. Before that, he had eaten whatever he could find himself. Wood lice, burdock roots, tough quinoa that he had to chew until his jaw ached. Now they had placed a bowl of liquid porridge on the threshold of the shed for him. The porridge was gray, made from that very same husk that they ground and boiled for hours until it became something vaguely resembling food. Daniel ate it and thought that this was the most important bowl of porridge in his life. Not because he was hungry, but because they believed him, at least a little. The days passed more quickly. The sprouts were gaining strength. By the 7th day, dense green bushes were poking out of the ground. The leaves were bright and sturdy, not a single spot, not a trace of gray mold. Daniel checked every day. Early Ripener 18 was bred from varieties resistant to a wide range of fungal diseases. He wasn't sure it would work against gray mold. But for now, the sprouts were clean. For now. On the 8th day, a woman came to him. The very same woman the boy had been dragging by the hand on the 1st day. She turned out not to be Finn's mother, but his aunt. His mother had died last year. The woman's name was May. She sat down silently next to Daniel by the field and stayed there for an hour. Then she said that her youngest daughter had lost sight in her left eye. Daniel wasn't a doctor, but he knew that night blindness and deteriorating vision were signs of severe vitamin deficiency, a lack of vitamin A. She needed carrots or any orange vegetable. He had carrots in his box, but that meant opening another bag, another last resort resource. He sat in the shed all evening counting, 41 bags. Each one had to be used to the max. Each one had to feed not just one person, but dozens. If he started opening them for every single case, he wouldn't have enough to last the long haul. But May had gone blind. She was 6. Daniel took a packet out of the box. Not extra carrots. He placed it next to the others and stared at it for a long time. 40 packets. He left the shed and went to May. He said he needed a separate plot. A small one, 2 by 3 meters, sheltered from the wind. May didn't understand why. Daniel said that in 2 months her daughter would see again. May looked at him and her lips trembled. She didn't say anything. She just turned around and went to look for a plot. On the 10th day, Daniel noticed a new person in the village, a woman of about 35, red hair tied back in a bun. Her hands were red and chapped. She was standing by his radish beds, silently examining the sprouts. When Daniel approached, she wasn't startled. She looked up at him with calm, hazel eyes and said that his sprouts weren't infected. She said it as one states the obvious, without surprise, with professional interest. Daniel asked who she was. She introduced herself as Lyra Venn. She said she was a herbalist. More accurately, she used to be an herbalist. Now she was just a widow who knew which roots were edible and which were not. Daniel asked why she was there. Lyra paused. Then she said that her husband had been burned at the stake 2 years ago, in the square in Crosstown, for heresy. He treated livestock with tansy tincture, and someone ratted him out. People from the Church of the Bright Mother came at dawn. By noon, all that was left of him was ashes. Lyra spoke of this in an even voice, without tears. The tears had dried up long ago. Daniel paused. Then he said that tansy really does contain a substance that helps with parasites in livestock, that her husband was right, about 80% right, that the mistake was only in the dosage. Lyra looked at him as if he had hit her. It didn't hurt, but in that place that had long been numb and suddenly began to feel. She asked what 80% meant. Daniel sat down right on the ground between the garden beds. He began to explain about Tujon, about how it works, about how important concentration is, about how healing isn't just about giving herbs, but about giving the right amount of the right herb at the right moment. Lyra listened without interrupting. Her hands rested on her knees, and she clenched her fingers so tightly that her knuckles turned white. When he finished, she was silent for a long time. Then she said she wanted to know more. Daniel nodded. From that day on, Lyra came every evening. She brought her supplies, little bags of dried herbs, roots, and bark. She laid them out on the barn floor, and Daniel explained what he knew. Not everything. He wasn't a pharmacologist. But he knew enough basic botany and phytochemistry to systematize what Lyra had been gathering blindly for years. He explained to her the difference between an infusion and a decoction. He explained why some substances dissolve in water and others in oil. He explained what concentration was and why the same herb could both heal and kill. Lyra took notes. She had no paper. She scratched with a thin splinter on a piece of birch bark. Slowly, carefully. Every word. On the 12th day, radish sprouts were already poking out of the ground in dense green rosettes. The root vegetables were swelling. Daniel checked their size every day. He pressed his finger to the base and felt something round and firm growing beneath the step. On the 14th day, he carefully dug up one root vegetable. Red, smooth, the size of a walnut. Still small, but already real. He put it back and covered it with soil. 4 more days. On the 15th day, it rained. Cold, long, and steady. Daniel spent the whole day by the field. He covered the beds with whatever he could find. Old sacks, burlap, anything that could protect the sprouts from the icy water. Finn helped in silence. The two of them crawled through the mud and weighed down the burlap with stones. By evening, they were both soaked to the bone and blue from the cold. Lyra brought them a hot brew made from some kind of root. Bitter, but warming. Daniel drank it and thought about how in his past life he'd had polycarbonate greenhouses and drip irrigation systems, and here he was, saving the crop with burlap and stones. On the 17th day, the rain stopped. Daniel removed the covering and inspected the beds. The sprouts had survived, every single one. The root vegetables had doubled in size. He dug up one again, the size of a child's fist, bright red, firm. Daniel turned it over in his hands. Not a single spot, not a single crack. A clean, healthy root vegetable. In a world where all the earth was gray. He put it back. One day. On the 18th day, he didn't go to the field at dawn. He waited in the barn. He sat on the straw and looked at his hands. They were dirty. Dirt had caked under his fingernails and into the cracks in his skin. The hands of an agronomist. He sat there until noon. Then he stood up and went out. Oren was already at the field. He stood and watched. Daniel approached. He knelt down. He grabbed the leaves of the first bush and pulled. The soil gave way easily. A radish lay in his hand. Red, round, the size of a child's fist. Firm, crunchy, fresh. Oren held out his hand. Daniel handed it to him. The old man turned the radish between his fingers, brought it to his nose, sniffed. His face remained unchanged. He took a bite, chewed slowly. Juice ran down his chin into his gray beard. Oren chewed and said nothing. Then he lowered his hand with the half-eaten radish and raised his other hand to his face. He covered his eyes with his palm. His shoulders shook. Daniel turned away. He began pulling up the rest, one by one. The red, firm root vegetables fell onto the gray earth in bright patches. Finn ran up and froze. Then he bolted back to the village with a scream. 10 minutes later, the whole village was standing by the field. They looked at the radishes as if they were a miracle. The old woman who had knelt over the sprouts on the first day knelt down again. But now, she held a red root vegetable in her hands and pressed it to her forehead. May stood with her daughter in her arms. The girl reached out toward the bright spot. Oren turned to Daniel. The elder's eyes were red. He said he'd thought they'd all die by winter. Daniel took a knife. He cut the radish in half. He held out a half to Oren. Oren looked at it. He took it. Daniel said quietly that they wouldn't die. But he needed one thing from the village elder. Silence. Not a word to anyone outside the village. Oren asked why. Daniel said that if they found out, they would come and take them away. Or worse, they would burn like Lyra's husband. Oren looked at Lyra. She was standing at the edge of the field, holding a bunch of greens in her hands. She nodded. Oren turned to Daniel and said he would swear an oath, and that he would make everyone in the village swear an oath too. After the radish, everything changed. Not right away, not dramatically, but it changed. People stopped looking at Daniel as an outsider. Now they looked at him with something else, with hope, and that frightened him much more. Hope meant expectations. Expectations meant he couldn't make a mistake. He sat in the shed and laid out the packets on the floor, 40 of them, -1. Every bag was a decision. Every bag was a choice of what to plant and when. If he got the order wrong, people would go hungry again. He started with the most important thing, Idaho Reserve potatoes, mini tubers. Maturity period under normal conditions, 65 days. Under airway conditions, he wasn't sure, but he was counting on 70 to 80 days. Potatoes are calories. They're sustenance. They're what can feed people not just for a week, but all winter long if stored properly. He chose a plot behind the shed. The soil there was heavy and clayey. It needed to be loosened up. He needed sand. He needed ash. He went to Oren. He explained what was needed. Oren assigned him 4 men. They dug for 2 days. Daniel showed them the depth of the furrows, the distance between the rows, the size of the holes. The men listened in silence. One of them, a limping, burly man named Bran, stopped digging halfway through the first day and asked why so deep. Daniel explained that the tubers grow underground, and the more space there is, the bigger the harvest. Bran snorted. He said that in Holmgrave, all their lives, they'd just thrown seeds into the furrow and waited. Daniel didn't criticize. He said theirs was a good method, but there was another, a little more complicated. but the harvest is 3 times bigger. Bran looked at him. Then he picked up the shovel again and started digging deeper. By evening on the second day, the beds were ready. Daniel opened the bag. Mini tubers, small as quail eggs. Bran took one in his hand and turned it over. He asked if this was a potato. Daniel nodded. Bran said it looked more like a pebble. Daniel said to wait 2 months. He planted them himself. Each tuber in its own hole. He covered each hole with a mixture of soil and ash. Lyra stood nearby and handed him the mixture. She already understood what Daniel was doing. He wasn't just planting. He was creating conditions. Every gesture had a purpose. Depth, distance. The rows ran east to west so the sun would shine evenly. Lyra took it all in. At the same time, Daniel planted carrots for his daughter May. In a small plot behind May's house, shielded from the wind by a wall, he explained to May how to water them, straight into the furrow, morning and evening. Don't overwater. May nodded and wrote down his words on a scrap of cloth with a piece of charcoal. Her daughter stood nearby, squinting her left eye. The right one was still fine. The left one could barely see anymore. 2 months. Daniel had 2 months to grow the carrots that would save that eye. He tried not to think about it. He couldn't. A week after planting the potatoes, people from the neighboring village came to Holmgrave. Or rather, they didn't come. They crawled. 5 of them. A man, 2 women, 2 children. The man called himself Hogg. He said he was from Upper Dole, a village 2 hours' walk to the north. 11 people remained there. They were eating bark. Hogg stood before Oren and spoke in the even voice of a man who had run out of strength even for despair. Oren led him to Daniel. Hogg looked at the garden beds, at the green rows of the second crop of radishes, at the fresh furrows for potatoes. His knees buckled. He sat right down on the ground and covered his face with his hands. Daniel sat down across from him. He asked what the soil was like in Upper Dole. Hogg raised his head. He didn't understand the question. Daniel repeated it. What kind of soil? Clay, sand, stone? What grows along the edges of the fields? Hogg began to describe it, slowly, confusingly. But Daniel listened and pieced together a picture. Loam, moderate acidity, a stream with clear water, a south-facing slope. The spot was even better than Holmgrave. He told Hogg he'd help, but he needed to see the field with his own eyes. Hogg said he didn't believe him, that for 3 years no one had been able to grow anything, that the druids of the Green Circle had come and said prayers and nothing had happened. Daniel didn't argue. He led Hogg to a garden bed and pulled out a radish. He held it out to him. Hogg looked at it as if it were a creature from another world. He reached out, took it, bit into it. He chewed. Then he began to cry, quietly, silently. Tears rolled down his unshaven cheeks and fell into the dust. His 2 children stood nearby, not understanding why their father was crying. Daniel gave each child a radish. The girl took a bite and laughed. She didn't know what it was. She didn't know the taste of a fresh vegetable. She was 4. She was born the year the Gray Sea began. All her life, she had eaten nothing but gruel made from husks. Daniel looked at her and thought of the packets in the box. 39 of them. The next morning, he went to Upper Dole. Finn and Lyra went with him. Finn because he knew the trail. Lyra because she wanted to look at the local grasses. Upper Dole was even worse than Daniel had expected. 11 people. 8 of them didn't get out of bed. 3 of the 7 houses stood with caved-in roofs. The fields were gray, just like everywhere else, but the stream was clear. Daniel tested the water. He brought his palm to his nose. No sweetish smell of spores. Clean. That was important. The spores of gray mold spread through the water. If the stream was clean, then the infection wasn't coming from here. That meant they could work. He examined the soil. Loam, just as Hogg had said. The acidity was slightly lower than in Holmgrave. Indicator weeds confirmed it. The southern slope got more sun. Daniel walked the plot in a grid pattern. He mapped it out in his head. He returned to Hogg and said that in a week he would send seeds and instructions, but the villagers themselves would do the planting. He couldn't be in 2 villages at once. Hogg said they didn't know how. Daniel said they would learn. He called for Lyra. He sat right on the ground in the middle of the empty field and began to explain how to mark out the beds, how to apply ash, how to determine acidity by looking at the weeds, how to water the furrows. Lyra repeated after him. She already knew most of it. She would come to Upper Dole every 3 days to check on things. Hogg listened and nodded. On the way back to Holmgrave, Lyra walked silently beside Daniel. It was already dark. Finn ran ahead with a torch made from a stick soaked in fat. Lyra asked where he knew all this from. Daniel didn't answer. She didn't repeat the question. She just walked beside him. Then she said she didn't care where he got it from. She said something else was important. That for the first time in 3 years, someone was doing something that made sense. Daniel looked at her. In the light of the torch, her face was orange and warm. Red hands, chapped skin, calm eyes. He said thank you. Lyra snorted. She said there was nothing to thank her for. She said she wasn't doing it for him, but for that girl who laughed when she tasted the radish. They walked to Holmgrave in silence. Daniel lay down in the barn and opened the box. 39 packets. He had to give 2 more to Upper Dole, radishes and potatoes. 37. Every decision reduced the number. Every packet was gone for good. And F1 hybrids didn't produce stable seeds in the 2nd generation. That meant the first harvest would be perfect. But the 2nd generation, grown from the harvested seeds, would split into a random set of traits. Something might grow, or nothing. He needed to stabilize the varieties, to breed open-pollinated lines from the hybrids. That was 3 or 4 seasons worth of work. Manual, painstaking, selecting the best plants, crossbreeding, selection again, generation after generation. If he didn't make it in time, his miracle would end after a single harvest. He closed the box, pressed his palm against it. 3 seasons. He needed to hold out for 3 seasons. On the 29th day, 2 events occurred in Holmgrave. The first was a good one. The potato tops had emerged from the ground and were gaining strength, so Bran came every morning and measured them with his hand. He placed his hand next to a sprout and grunted. He said that yesterday it had been up to his wrist, and today up to his far. Bran turned out to be one of those people who grumble but get things done. He grumbled that he'd never seen a garden like this. He grumbled that he had to dig deeper than he was used to. He grumbled that watering the furrows was foolish. But he did everything exactly as Daniel had shown him, and the tops were growing. The second event was bad. 3 horsemen appeared on the trail to Holmgrave. Oren saw them first. He was standing by the well, and his face turned to stone. He quickly walked over to Daniel. He said one word, soldiers. Daniel looked at the sprouting potatoes. He looked at the shed where the box stood. He looked at Oren. He asked whose they were. Oren said they were most likely Baron Grace's men, the very same one who had taken the last of the grain from the barn 3 weeks ago. Daniel told Oren to hide the box. Oren took it and carried it to the cellar of his house. He covered it with old hides. Daniel went out onto the path. The 3 riders were in chainmail, swords at their belts. The horses were skinny. It was clear that Baron Grace hadn't lived any better than the rest. The one in front dismounted. Young, about 25, a sharp face. His eyes were quick. He looked Daniel up and down. He asked who he was. Daniel said he was a vagabond. He worked for food. The soldier snorted. He said there was no food in Holmgrave. He knew this because he'd taken it himself. Daniel said nothing. The soldier scanned the village. His gaze caught on something. Daniel followed his line of sight. The soldier was looking at the garden beds, at the green rows of second-crop radishes. In a world where everything was gray, the green could be seen 100 paces away. The soldier slowly walked toward the garden beds, Daniel walked beside him. His heart was pounding. The soldier stopped at the edge and looked down. Green sprouts, even, thick, bright. The soldier crouched down. He reached out and touched a leaf. Then he turned to Daniel. His face had changed. Not anger, not greed, astonishment. He asked how. Daniel said it was just radishes, said the soil by the river was good. Ash, proper watering. The soldier shook his head, said that Baron Grace pays the president of the Green Circle 10 silver coins a week, and in 3 years they hadn't grown a single stalk. And here was some vagabond with a garden full of greens. Daniel shrugged. The second soldier remained on his horse. He was older and more taciturn. He wasn't looking at the garden beds, but at Daniel, intently. The third walked through the village and peeked into the houses. The young soldier stood up. He said he would report to the Baron. He said the Baron would want to see it for himself. Daniel said it was just a single garden bed and nothing special. The soldier smirked. He said that in the world of the Gray Plague, a single green garden was the most extraordinary thing one could see. They rode off. Daniel stood on the path and watched them go. Lyra approached quietly. She stood beside him. She said it was bad. Daniel nodded. It was very bad. Baron Grace might come and simply take everything. The seeds, the harvest, him. Lock him in the castle dungeon and force him to work. Or hand him over to the church as a heretic. Or sell him to the Grain Merchants Guild for a good price. Daniel returned to the barn. He took a box out of Oren's cellar. He counted the bags, 37. Each one was more valuable than gold, and now they might find out about them. He sat up all night without sleep, thinking. By morning, he had a plan. Not a good one, just the only one. He went to Oren, said 2 things needed to be done. First, the garden beds by the river needed to be camouflaged. Cover the edges with dry leaves and gray stalks so the green wouldn't be visible from a distance. Second, he needed another base, a place where he could work without prying eyes. Oren thought for a long time. Then he said that 2 hours' walk west through the forest stood an abandoned mill. Old, stone walls. The roof was still there, a pond nearby, surrounded by forest. Only the locals knew the path to it. Daniel said it was perfect. They set out the next day. Daniel, Oren, Finn, Lyra, and Bran. Bran walked behind them with an axe slung over his shoulder and looked like a man who really wanted to hit someone. The mill turned out to be exactly what they needed. Stone walls, thick ones, a roof of stone tiles, dry inside. The millstones are in place. A clearing all around, 200 by 100 meters, enclosed by forest on all sides. The pond is clean. Daniel checked the water. No algae. He surveyed the clearing. Forest soil. Soft. Rich in humus. Leaves had been rotting here for decades, creating a fertile layer. Moderate acidity. Enough sunlight filtered through the canopy. Not ideal. But he could thin out the trees along the southern edge and let in more light. He turned to the others. He said this would be his nursery. Here he would develop stable varieties. This would be his main work for the next 3 years. Oren asked what stable varieties meant. Daniel sat down on a rock by the pond. He knew he had to explain. Not because they needed to know, but because they needed to understand why he couldn't give away all the seeds right now. He said his seeds were special. The first harvest would be excellent. But if they planted seeds from that harvest, the second generation would be poor, random, unpredictable. It's like children of beautiful parents. Sometimes they look alike, sometimes they don't. Oren frowned. He asked what to do. Daniel said he could fix it. He could select the best plants from the second generation, cross them with each other, select the best ones again, and after 3 or 4 such cycles, get a variety that produces an equally good harvest every time, from its own seeds, forever. Oren was silent. Then he asked quietly, "Forever?" Daniel nodded. "Forever." Lyra moved closer. She had understood before Oren did. She said quietly that this meant the villages would be able to feed themselves. Without Daniel. Daniel nodded. Exactly. That was his goal. Not to be the one who feeds them, to become the one who teaches them to feed themselves, and then to leave. Bran grunted. He said there was no need to go anywhere. He said that as long as there was something to repair, he would remain useful. Daniel looked at Bran and smiled for the first time in all these days. They began work at the mill that very day. Bran and 2 men from the village repaired the roof. Finn hauled water from the pond. Lyra cleared the clearing. Daniel marked out the garden beds, small ones, neat, each for its own variety. A separate plot for selective breeding, a separate one for the main harvest, a separate one for experiments. He worked with the precision of a man who knows that every mistake costs lives, because that's exactly how it was. By evening, the mill looked like a small farm. Rough, primitive, but alive. Daniel stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the marked-out beds. 37 packets in the box. 3 years of work ahead. Barren Grace somewhere beyond the forest. The Church of the Bright Mother somewhere to the south. Hunger all around. But here, in this clearing, among the stones of the old mill, he could work. Lyra approached, stood beside him, quietly said that the mill was a good place, that it smelled of life here. Daniel nodded, then said, "We'll start planting wheat tomorrow. Cascade 12 wheat, the most important packet in the box." Daniel held it in his palm and felt its weight. Not physical, the weight of responsibility. Cascade 12 was an F1 hybrid bred specifically for resistance to fusarium and brown rust. The seeds in this packet were the result of 30 years of breeding work by dozens of scientists. Every single grain carried genetics that could not be reproduced without a laboratory and a crossbreeding program. And he was about to pour them into the soil of a medieval world and pray that everything would work out. He didn't pray, of course. He calculated. The clearing's area, the number of seeds, the optimal sowing density, the planting depth, the time to germination, the time to heading, the time to maturity. Under normal conditions, Cascade 12 yielded a harvest in 80 to 90 days. But the variety description had a note that he remembered because he'd written it in himself. With increased sunlight and optimal nutrition, the period is reduced to 50 to 60 days. He didn't know what the sunlight conditions were like here. He didn't know the length of daylight. He didn't know the temperature range. But it felt like late spring. The days were long. The sun was warm. If he planted now, then in 2 months, maybe they would have bread. He planted wheat on 3 plots. The main one on the large clearing, a small test plot by the mill wall, and a breeding plot separately off to the side. On the breeding plot, he sowed sparsely. Each plant had to grow separately, so he could see every ear, evaluate every stalk, select the best ones for the next generation. This was the first step towards stabilization. Lyra helped. She already understood the logic. She asked the right questions. Why are these seeds separate? Why is the spacing wider? Why does he mark each row with a stick and a rag of a different color? Daniel explained, patiently, in detail, just as he explained to grandmothers on his YouTube channel why their tomatoes crack. Only here, understanding didn't determine the quality of the tomato, but people's lives. A week passed. The wheat sprouted. Thin green needles pierced the gray earth and reached toward the light. Daniel stood over the plot and his hands were shaking. Not from the cold, from relief. It had worked. Cascade 12 was growing in Airway's soil. Growing fast. Growing clean. Not a single spot of gray mold on the seedlings. Resistance to fusarium apparently provided some protection against the local fungus as well. Just as he had hoped. But he hadn't been sure until this very moment. The news about the wheat spread through the small circle instantly. Oren came to the mill and stood over the plot for a long time. Then he said quietly that he hadn't seen green wheat in 3 years. Bran approached and silently took off his hat. Daniel didn't understand why. Then he understood. Bran stood before the wheat sprouts, as if before something sacred. In this world, wheat was sacred. He who fed ruled, and he who grew wheat in the world of the Greymoor was something greater than just a man. Daniel didn't like that. He told Bran to put his hat back on. He said it was just a plant, that it grew not from prayer but from the nitrogen in the soil. Bran put his hat back on, but looked at him with an expression that clearly said Bran didn't agree. Meanwhile, in Holmgrave, the potatoes were growing. The tops had risen above the knees, sturdy, green, dark, not a single yellow leaf, not a single spot. The village tiptoed around the rows. No one dared step near them. The children stood at a respectful distance and watched as Daniel hilled the plants. He showed them, explained why. We pile soil up against the stems so the tubers don't stick out. If a tuber is exposed to the sun, it will turn green and become poisonous. Finn listened with his mouth agape. Then he picked up a hoe himself and began hilling. Crooked, but diligent. Daniel adjusted his hand, showed him the angle, showed him the depth. Finn tried again. Better, Daniel nodded, said good. Finn looked at him and smiled for the first time. 2 teeth were missing. His gums were pale from vitamin deficiency, but the smile was genuine. 3 days after the wheat sprouted, a person Daniel wasn't expecting appeared on the path to the mill. A girl, about 19 years old, freckles all over her face, her hands in the dirt. Her dry straw-colored hair was pulled back with a piece of string. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at the garden beds with the same expression others use to watch the sunset. Daniel asked who she was. She said her name was Elsa, Oren's daughter. Daniel didn't know Oren had a daughter. Oren hadn't mentioned her. Elsa said her father had forbidden her from coming here. He was afraid. She said she'd come on her own, because she wanted to learn. Daniel asked what? Elsa swept her arm across the clearing and said this. All of this. Daniel looked at her. He saw dirt under her fingernails, calluses on her palms, her straight back. She wasn't weak. She was one of those who had been plowing fields since she was 12. He asked how she knew when it was time to plow. Elsa was surprised by the question. Then she answered. By the soil. You take a clod in your hand and squeeze it. If it crumbles, it's too dry. If it sticks, it's too wet. If it holds together but crumbles at the edges, it's just right. Daniel nodded. He said that was right. He said there are people with advanced degrees who explain the same thing with long words, but the essence is the same. The point is in the hand that feels. Elsa looked at him. No one had ever told her before that she knew anything. No one had ever asked her opinion before. Wandering schoolboys passed through the village and laughed at the peasant girl who didn't know her letters. And this stranger sat down in front of her and said, "Show me." She lowered her eyes. Then she raised them. She said she wanted to stay. Daniel nodded. From that day on, Elsa came to the mill every day. She was the first one in the clearing in the morning and the last to leave in the evening. She memorized everything. She didn't write it down because she didn't know how to write. But she memorized it. With her hands, with her eyes, through repetition. Daniel showed her how to thin out the plants, how to mulch, how to identify nutrient deficiencies by the color of the leaves. Yellow edges mean potassium, pale green means nitrogen, a purple tint means phosphorus. Elsa soaked it all in. Within a week, she could walk through the garden and tell what each plant needed. Not in Daniel's words, in her own. She'd say, "This one wants to drink. This one wants to eat. This one's cramped." Daniel listened and realized she was right, every single time. On the 45th day, what Daniel had feared happened. Hogg from Upper Dole came to the mill, but he wasn't alone. 4 others were with him, people from 2 villages to the east, Westmid and Olchenau. They had heard, not from Hogg, not from Oren. They had heard from someone on the road who had seen greenery in Holmgrave. Rumors had leaked out. The four stood in the clearing and looked at the wheat. It was already knee-high, a green wall in the midst of a gray world. One of them, an elderly man from Westmid, fell to his knees and began to recite a prayer to the Bright Mother. Daniel winced, not because of this man's faith, because along with the prayer, words would travel down the roads. A green stranger, a miracle at the mill, wheat that grows in a month. Every such word brought closer the moment when a man with a sword and an order would stand at the mill's threshold, not a hungry peasant. He looked at Lyra. She understood. She approached him and whispered that they needed to hurry. Daniel nodded. They had to sow as much as possible while there was still time. He opened the box that night and laid the packets out in a row. 34 remained. He selected 6. Radishes, potatoes, carrots, peas, cabbage, and a second packet of a different kind of wheat, just in case Cascade 12 failed. 6 packets for 4 villages. 28 would remain. He sent the seeds and instructions with Lyra and Elsa. Lyra was heading to Westmid, Elsa to Olchenau. Each carried the packets and the knowledge. Each knew what to do. Daniel stayed at the mill, alone, with the wheat, with an empty clearing that grew greener with each passing day. He sat by the mill wall and looked at his garden beds, green rectangles amid the gray forest, small, fragile, but alive. On the control plot, the wheat grew a little slower. He recorded his observations with charcoal on a stone. Stem height, number of leaves, color, density. Day after day, just like in a laboratory. Only the laboratory was a stone mill, and the notebook was a wall. On the 50th day, the wheat in the main plot produced an ear. Daniel saw it in the morning. Slender, green, still empty, but already taking shape, full of promise. He stood among his wheat and touched that first ear with his fingers, gently, as if it were a living creature, because it was alive, and because everything, whether people would have food to eat. Then he heard footsteps behind him and turned around. At the edge of the clearing stood a girl he had never seen before, pale, slender. Her fingers were stained with ink. Her wet hair clung to her forehead. She wore a nun's habit, but it was torn and dirty, as if she had been walking through the forest for several days. She looked at the wheat, then at Daniel, then back at the wheat. She said her name was Silène Marot, that she had fled from the convent of Saint Ma, that they wanted to burn her for copying forbidden herbals in the library, that she had been walking through the forest for 4 days, according to rumors, that she was looking for the man who made the earth bear fruit. She spoke quickly, nervously, glancing around. Daniel stepped closer. He saw burns on her hands, not from fire, from ropes. Her wrists were rubbed raw. She had escaped from custody. He told her to go inside the mill. Lyra, who had just returned from Westmead, examined her hands, washed them, bandaged them, gave her a decoction. Silene drank it and trembled. Daniel waited. When she had calmed down a little, he asked what kind of herbals she had been copying. Silene pulled a bundle from her bosom. She unwrapped the cloth. Inside were sheets of parchment covered in small, neat handwriting. Copies, dozens of pages, descriptions of plants, properties, uses, drawings of roots and leaves, everything meticulous, everything detailed. Daniel took one sheet. He read it. He looked up. These notes weren't just herbalist notes. It was a system, a classification of plants by their properties, primitive but logical. Whoever wrote the original, that person thought like a scientist. Daniel told Silene that this wasn't heresy. He said it was botany. He said let him write down the correct names. Silene looked at him and her eyes grew wide. All her life in the convent, she had been told that her curiosity was a sin. That knowledge of plants without prayer was a path to the Dark One. That she should pray, not read. And this man had taken her notes and said they were correct, that they were valuable, that they were needed. She covered her face with her hands and cried. For a long time. Quietly. Lyra hugged her and held her until she stopped shaking. That evening, Daniel sat with Cillian at the table in the mill and went over her notes. She knew more than he had expected. She knew the local plants. She knew their properties. She knew what worked and what didn't. She lacked a system. She lacked an understanding of why one thing worked and another didn't. Daniel began to explain. He spoke and saw her eyes light up. How she grabbed a piece of charcoal and began to write. Quickly, eagerly, every word. She was a bookish person. She thought in text. And for the first time in her life, she was given text she didn't have to hide. Lyra watched them from the corner. She brought in a hot potion and silently set it on the table. Then she sat down nearby. She listened and began to add. Her own knowledge. Practical. Not from books, but from her hands. Lyra knew what it was like to work in the fields. Cillian knew what was written in the books. Daniel knew why both worked. The three of them pored over Cillian's parchments until late into the night. They noted what was correct, what was wrong, what could be improved. By morning, they had the first draft of what Cillian would later call the Book of the Green Table. Daniel stepped out of the mill at dawn. The wheat stood still and green in the morning mist. The ears swayed. There were more of them, many more. He touched the nearest one. Solid, filling out. 10 more days, maybe 15, and there would be grain. There would be flour. There would be bread. He turned around. Lyra and Cillian were standing in the mill's doorway, both holding mugs, both with eyes red from sleeplessness, both alive, both needed. Both having found the place where their knowledge is not a disgrace, but a salvation. Daniel thought that this was the most important thing he had done in this world. Not the garden beds, not the seeds, but the faces of people who, for the first time in years, were not afraid to know. On the 60th day, the Cascade 12 wheat stood waist high. The ears had filled out and grown heavy. They bent toward the ground under their own weight, and Daniel walked between the rows, touching each one. Solid, full. The kernels inside had already hardened. Another week, maybe 5 days. He pulled out a single ear and rubbed it in his palms. The kernels rolled onto his skin, golden, large, without a single blemish, without a single speck. He brought them to his nose. The scent was pure, grainy, warm, a scent that had vanished from this world 3 years ago. Daniel clenched the grains in his fist and closed his eyes. It had worked. Cascade 12 had worked. Now he had to bring in the harvest without losing a single ear of corn. He gathered everyone at the mill. Oren, Bran, Lyra, Elsa, Cillian, Finn, and 4 men from Upper Dole who had now come to help. 12 people. Daniel explained the plan. Reap with sickles, bind the sheaves, dry them in the clearing for 3 days, then thresh them on the millstones. Every grain counts. Not a single one must fall to the ground and be lost. Bran asked why such precision was needed. Daniel said it was because they had to select the best grain from this harvest for the next planting, and grind the rest into flour. And this flour had to be enough to prove one important thing. Bran asked what that was. Daniel said he would find out soon. The harvest began at dawn on the 65th day. Daniel cut the first ear himself. His hands remembered. He had harvested wheat in field trials dozens of times. Only there was a combine harvester, and here a sickle. But the motion was the same. Grasp, cut, stacking. Elsa stood beside him. She reaped faster than he did. The peasant girl's hands worked the sickle as if it were an extension of her body. Daniel watched her and thought that this girl didn't need his help, but his knowledge. She had her own hands. and they were better than his. By noon, the main plot had been harvested. The sheaves stood in rows on the clearing, golden amid the green and gray. Bran carried them on his shoulder, 4 at a time, and stacked them with the precision that gave him away as a former soldier. Daniel had once asked him if he'd served in the military. Bran grunted. He said 5 years at Baron Grace's garrison, then a limp and discharge. Daniel didn't ask where the limp came from. Bran told him himself later. An arrow in the knee. On the road. Not in battle. Just bandits. He killed 2, but the 3rd managed to shoot him. Bran told the story as one might talk about the weather, without anger, without regret. It happened and is over. 3 days of drying. Daniel checked the sheaves every few hours, turned them over, felt them, sniffed them. Not a single sign of mold, not a single spore. On the 4th day, they began threshing. The mill came to life. The millstones creaked. Finn turned the lever while Bran fed in the grain. The flour poured into the waiting sack, white and clean. Lyra scooped up a handful, rubbed it between her fingers, sniffed. She looked at Daniel and nodded slowly. Real flour, white, no bitterness, no grayish tint. Flour you can bake bread with. Daniel set aside a seed stock, the best grains from the best ears of the breeding plot, each one selected by hand, large, full, uniform in shape. These were the candidates for stabilization. The 2nd generation would split, but among those that split, there would be some that retained the desired traits. He would select those and sow them again, and so on 3 or 4 times, until the variety became stable. He put the seed stock in a separate pouch and hid it in a dry spot in the mill wall, behind a stone, where neither moisture nor mice could reach it. From the remaining flour, he took 3 handfuls. He kneaded the dough. Simple. Flour, water, a pinch of ash instead of salt. He rolled out the flatbread on the stone. He placed it on the flat, red-hot millstone that Bran had heated over a fire. The scent wafted across the clearing. Everyone froze. Lyra stood by the mill wall, her hands pressed to her chest. Silene sat on the threshold and stopped writing. Her pen froze in midair. Finn stepped closer and sniffed. His eyes grew moist. The smell of fresh bread. In a world where for 3 years there had been nothing but the smell of mold and hunger. The flatbread browned. Daniel took it off the millstone, broke it in half. Steam rose up. He held out the first piece to Orin. The old man took it with both hands, brought it to his face, closed his eyes, stood there for a long time. Then took a bite, chewed slowly. Tears streamed down his cheeks, but his face was calm. He chewed and was silent and wept, and it was the quietest and loudest thing Daniel had ever seen in this world. He handed out the rest, a piece to each, small but real. Bran chewed with his eyes closed, and his massive shoulders trembled. Elsa took a bite and froze. She stared at the piece of bread in her hand as if it might vanish. Silene ate and wrote at the same time. Tears dripped onto the parchment and smudged the ink. Lyra didn't eat. She stood and watched the others. Daniel walked over to her. He held out the last piece. Lyra shook her head. She said that what she saw was enough for her. Daniel said, "Eat." She looked him in the eyes. She took it, took a bite, and for the first time in all the time he'd known her, Lyra Venn smiled. Not a smirk, not a chuckle, a smile, open, warm, like someone who'd had something important taken away and suddenly had it returned. Daniel turned away. A lump formed in his throat. He walked over to the sack of flour and began to count. There wasn't much flour. 2 sacks, about 50 kilograms. That would last a month for Holmgrave if he was careful. But he wasn't going to be careful. He was going to bake bread, lots of bread, and take it to where the right people would see it. But that was later. Right now, there was another problem. That evening, Elsa appeared on the path to the mill. She was running. Daniel saw her face and knew something bad had happened. Elsa stopped, gasping for breath. She said that people had come to Holmgrave. Not soldiers. Worse. Churchmen. Two in gray robes with the symbol of the Bright Mother on their chests. They're walking through the village and asking questions. About the stranger. About the green garden beds. About the miracle. Someone had told them after all. Who one of those four who came with Hogg? Or someone on the road? It doesn't matter. The rumor reached the church. Daniel sat down on a rock. His hands went cold. The Church of the Bright Mother. The very one that burned Lyra's husband. The very one that burns herbalists and healers and anyone who tries to treat or grow things without prayer. Lyra stood nearby, her face pale. Cillian pressed herself against the mill wall and wrapped her arms around herself. She knew better than anyone what the church's attention meant. She had been running from that attention for 4 days through the forest. Daniel thought quickly. The churchmen were in the village. They could see the empty garden beds because Orin had camouflaged them after the soldiers' visit. But the people don't know how to keep quiet, especially hungry people who've been given hope. Someone will speak up. Someone already has. He needed time, at least 2 more months. The second crop of wheat was already in the ground. The potatoes in Holmgrave were nearly ripe. The carrots for his daughter May were coming into color. If they take him now, everything will stop.
He turned to Elsa. He asked what exactly the clergymen were asking. Elsa said they were asking about a man who farms without prayer, who commands the land, who defies the mother's will. Daniel nodded. He asked if they had seen him. Elsa said no. They don't know what he looks like. They only know there's a stranger. Daniel said okay. He said he needed the clergy to leave empty-handed. For that to happen, the village had to keep quiet. Everyone. Elsa said her father was already talking to the people. Daniel nodded. Then he looked at Lyra. Lyra understood without words. She left for Holmgrave that same night. She returned at dawn. She said the clergyman had spent the night at the village elder's house. Orin had received them as was proper. He fed them what he had, porridge made from husks. The clergyman grimaced but ate. In the morning, they walked around the village. They saw the camouflaged garden beds, but the dry leaves and gray stalks had done their job. The garden beds looked like a dead field. The clergyman questioned the old men by the well. They remained silent. They questioned the women. They remained silent. They questioned the children. Finn looked the clergyman in the eye and said there were no strangers, that everyone in Holmgrave was one of their own, that there was nothing to eat here and nothing to see. The churchman patted him on the head and left. By noon, they had left, heading south, toward Crosstown. Daniel exhaled, but he knew it was only temporary. They would return, with reinforcements, with questions, with fire. He needed to hurry. He spent the entire next day in the breeding plot, the second sowing of wheat from the seed stock of the first harvest. He planted each grain separately, a palm's width apart. Each plant had to grow in isolation, so he could see the variation, so he could select those that retained the cascade traits: resistance, early maturity, full ears. This was the work of a breeder. Quiet, unobtrusive, boring to anyone except those who understood. Elsa understood. She sat nearby and helped, silently. Her fingers worked precisely and carefully. She placed each seed in a hole with the same care one uses to lay a child to rest. Daniel looked at her. She didn't notice. She was focused on the seeds, freckles on her nose, dirt under her fingernails. A strand of hair slipped out from under the headband and fell onto her cheek. Daniel turned away to his row. They worked side by side for 3 hours. At one point, their hands touched over a single hole. Both froze.
for a second. Then both pulled their hands away at the same time. Elsa stared at the ground. Daniel stared at the ground. Neither of them said a word. They continued planting, in silence, but the distance between them had grown slightly smaller. On the 72nd day, the potatoes in Holmgrave were ready. Daniel came to the garden in the morning and saw that the tops had begun to turn yellow, not from disease, from ripeness. He dropped to his knees and dug up the first plant. The soil gave way and the tubers rolled out into the light. Bran stood behind him and exhaled loudly. The tubers were the size of 2 fists, smooth, yellow, firm. 7 of them from a single plant. Daniel held one in the palm of his hand, heavy, real, half a kilo at least. He set it on the ground and dug up the second plant, 8 tubers, the third, 6, but each one was large. Bran crouched down beside him. He picked up a tuber, turned it over, sniffed it. He looked at Daniel and said quietly that in Crosstown, they'd kill you on the spot for potatoes like these. Daniel nodded. That was exactly why no one must know about it. They dug all day, the whole village, 23 people on their knees in the dirt. They pulled each tuber out by hand, carefully, like a treasure. The children put them in baskets and carried them to the barn. The barn was old and full of holes. Daniel had inspected it the day before and was horrified. Cracks in the walls, mice, dampness. If you put potatoes in here, half of them will rot in a month. He spent 2 days before the harvest getting the barn in order. He explained to Bran how to patch the cracks. He showed him how to make raised platforms out of poles so air could circulate from below. He showed him how to line the floor with ash and dry wormwood to keep the mice away. Bran grumbled that they'd stored them on the ground their whole lives and nothing happened. Daniel replied that half the harvest had rotted their whole lives. Bran fell silent, because it was true. The harvest results stunned even Daniel. From a small plot behind the shed, they harvested nearly 400 kilograms of potatoes. 400. From an area less than 200 square meters. In the best years, local varieties yielded 30 to 40 kilograms from that area. Oren stood before the mountain of potatoes in the barn and couldn't speak. He opened his mouth and closed it. Then he turned to Daniel. His face was strange, a mixture of gratitude and horror. He said quietly that now he understood why Daniel had told him to keep quiet. He said that if anyone found out about a harvest like this, the army would come. Not a detachment, the army. Daniel nodded. 400 kilograms of potatoes. That would be enough for Holmgrave for the whole winter, with plenty to spare. For the first time in 3 years, the village wouldn't have to fear the cold. But 400 kilograms was also news that would destroy them if it got out. That same evening, May came to Daniel with her daughter. The girl's name was Annie. She was holding a carrot in her hand. Orange, bright, long. From those very same garden beds behind May's house, the carrots were ripe. May said nothing. She just stood there, holding her daughter by the shoulders. Annie ate the carrot and crunched on it. Juice dripped down her chin. She squinted with pleasure. May quietly said that Annie could see, her left eye. Not completely, but better than a month ago. Her peripheral vision had returned. May said that and fell silent. Her lips were trembling. Daniel crouched down in front of Annie. He looked into her eyes. Her left pupil was reacting to the light, slowly, but it was reacting. The vitamin A was starting to work. 2 more months of regular intake and her vision would be restored. He told this to May. She nodded. Then she silently hugged him, quickly, tightly, and left. Daniel stood in the yard and watched them go. A little girl with a carrot in her hand walked down the path, turning her head this way and that, testing her left eye, learning to see the world whole again. He went back to his work. There was much to do, Upper Dal had sent a messenger. Their radishes had ripened. People were crying. They asked for more seeds. West Mid and Olchenau had also seen their first potato sprouts. The network was growing. Daniel spread out on the mill floor the map he had been drawing in the evenings on a piece of leather. 5 points. Holmgreave, Upper Dole, West Mid, Olchenau. The mill. A small green archipelago in a gray ocean. 28 packets in a box. He couldn't grow any faster. Every new village meant losing 2 or 3 packets. Every packet was gone for good. If he gave everything away now, there would be nothing left in 6 months, because F1 hybrids don't produce stable offspring. He had to stay the course. Give out just enough so people wouldn't starve, but not so much that he'd deplete the supply before stabilization is complete. It was a balancing act on a knife's edge. Every night he counted the packets. Every night he made calculations. How much grain the second crop would yield. How many of the second generation would retain the desired traits. What the split percentage would be. What the selection percentage would be. In the lab, a computer did this in seconds. Here, he counted with sticks on the ground. On the 78th day, Hogg came to the mill. But not for seeds. He brought a woman with him. Tall, muscular, with a tight black braid and a slight accent. A sword hung from her belt. Not a decorative one, a working one, with a worn hilt. Hogg said she had arrived in Upper Dole 2 days ago. She had asked about the Green Man. He was scared, thought she was a spy. But she asked to see the garden beds. She looked at them for a long time. Then she sat down and said she would stay. Hogg didn't know what to do with her and brought her to Daniel. The woman stood at the edge of the clearing and said nothing. Her eyes swept over the garden beds, over the wheat, over the mill's walls, over the faces of Lyra and Cillian. Then they rested on Daniel. She introduced herself as Sa-Ah-Han. She said she was from the eastern continent of Goryeo. She said her village had died in the first year of the Gray Plague. Everyone, parents, brothers, neighbors. She had arrived too late, when there was no one left to save. She had been walking ever since, 2 years, across the entire continent. Her sword had fed her, guarding caravans, hired work, but the caravans carried less, and there was less and less work because there was nothing left to carry. She heard a rumor on the southern road, a man who makes the earth bear fruit. She had been following that rumor for 3 weeks. Daniel asked why. Saya was silent. Then she said she didn't want what happened to her village to happen to another, that her sword couldn't save her people. But maybe it could save his people if he let it. Daniel looked at her, tall, calm, eyes like stone, a person who had survived the worst and come out the other side. He said he wouldn't pay. Saya smiled. She said she hadn't seen bread in 2 years. If he fed her once a day, she would stay. Daniel nodded. That evening, he sat by the fire in the clearing. Saya sat by the mill wall, sharpening her sword. The sound was steady and rhythmic. Lyra was cooking a stew of potatoes and herbs. Cillian was writing by the light of the fire. Elsa was mending the floorboards on the drying rack. Finn was sleeping curled up in a ball by the doorway. Daniel watched them and thought that he now had a team, not an army, not an organization, just people, each with their own pain, each having found here a reason not to die. Lyra knew plants, Cillian knew books, Elsa knew the land, Sa'a knew how to kill those who would try to take it all away, and he knew how to make the grain grow. Together, they were something this world had never seen before. In the middle of the night, Daniel woke up to a sound. Sa'a was standing at the edge of the clearing with a sword in her hand. She was staring into the darkness of the forest. Daniel approached quietly. He asked what was wrong. She said she'd heard footsteps. 2, maybe 3. They'd gone east. Daniel asked who. Sa'a said she didn't know, but they'd been here, and they'd seen the wheat. Daniel returned to the mill. He sat down in front of the box. 28 bags. 5 villages. The church knows about him. The Baron knows about him. Now someone is wandering around his mill at night. The walls were closing in. He looked at his hands. An agronomist, not a soldier, not a politician, not a hero. An agronomist. He was 29 years old. He knew how to breed hardy varieties of wheat. Nothing else. But everything now depended on that nothing. On the 91st day, a rider galloped up to the mill. Alone, unarmed, in a leather traveling cloak bearing a coat of arms Daniel did not recognize. Sei came out to meet him with a sword. The rider dismounted and raised his hands. He said he was a lieutenant in the Westmark Royal Intelligence. He gave his name as ManhwaCapped. He said he had come on the orders of Her Majesty Queen Regent Annalise Westmark. The order was simple: observe and report. Sei did not sheathe her sword. Daniel stepped out of the mill. ManhwaCapped was young, around 30, slender, tanned, an attentive face, the eyes of a man who has seen much and remembers everything. Daniel asked how he had found the mill. Marin said that 3 villages to the east were talking about a green stranger, that the peasants were whispering on the roads, that at the market in Crosstown, a merchant swore he had seen fresh radishes, fresh, red, in the world of the Grey Moor. That was enough to pique the crown's interest. Daniel was silent. Marin surveyed the clearing. His gaze lingered on the wheat. The second crop was already ankle-high, green, even. Marin stepped closer. He crouched down. He touched a sprout. Then he stood up and turned to Daniel. His face was strange, like Oren's on that first day, amazement mixed with disbelief. He asked how. Daniel said the same thing he'd told everyone: the right soil, the right seeds, the right work. No magic. Marin shook his head. He said that the druids of the Green Circle had been praying and burning herbs for 3 years, and nothing. But one man, without prayer, had grown wheat. Daniel said that wheat grows not from prayer, but from nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Marin didn't understand. Daniel didn't bother to explain. He asked what the crown wanted. Marin told the truth. The crown wants to know who he is, what he can do, and whether it can be scaled up. Of course, he didn't use the word scale. He asked if it could be done the same way in every village in the kingdom. Daniel said it was possible, but not now. It would take time, a year at least. Marin asked why a year. Daniel said because the seeds were limited, and they needed to develop stable varieties. Marin didn't understand the details, but caught the word limited. He looked at Daniel differently, more attentively, as if he were looking at a man who possessed something very precious and very fragile. Daniel said he needed one thing: to be left alone for a year. So the crown wouldn't send soldiers or take him to the capital. In a year, he'd be ready to talk. Marin said he couldn't promise, but he could report it. Daniel said fine. Then he paused and did what he'd planned from the moment he first ground the flour. He went into the mill and carried out 2 sacks, one with flour, one with potatoes. He handed them to Marin, said they were for Her Majesty, personally. Marin took the sacks, and his hands trembled under the weight. He opened the one with the flour. He stuck his hand inside, pulled out a handful, white, pure. He brought it to his nose. His eyes widened. He looked at Daniel, and for the first time during the entire conversation, lost his composure. His voice trembled as he asked if it was real wheat flour. Daniel nodded. Marin stood there with a handful of flour in his hand, his face contorted, the muscles in his cheekbones twitched. He swallowed. Then he carefully poured the flour back in and tied the sack shut.
He said he would report the facts as they were, that he would neither embellish nor downplay them. Then he mounted his horse and rode off, with 2 sacks on the horse's back. Saye sheathed her sword and approached Daniel. She said quietly that he was taking a risk. Daniel nodded. He said he had no choice. Sooner or later, the crown would come. Better that it come well-fed and grateful than hungry and angry. A sack of flour for the queen is not a gift. It's a bargaining chip. Sae snorted. She said that on Goryeo, such bargaining chips are called the first arrow. It doesn't kill, but it shows the way. Daniel looked at her and thought that for a quiet person, she sometimes spoke very accurately. 2 weeks had passed. The second wheat crop was gaining strength. In the breeding plot, Daniel saw a split. The second generation, grown from seeds of the first harvest, produced different plants. Some were tall with good ears. Others were thin and weak. Still others had spots on their leaves. He walked between the rows every day. He marked the best ones with sticks wrapped in blue cloth. The best were those that grew quickly. They had thick stems and full ears, clean leaves without any signs of fungus. There were 15 such plants out of 100. The remaining 85 would be used for grain and flour. The 15 best would provide seeds for the third generation, and so on until the percentage of the best rose from 15 to 90. Then the variety will be stable. Elsa walked with him every day. She could already see the difference herself. She pointed and said, "This one's good, not this one." Daniel checked. She was rarely wrong. She had an eye for it. That very eye of a breeder that can't be learned from a textbook. The kind you either have or you don't. Elsa had it. Daniel told her this. He said she had a talent. Elsa blushed and turned away. She mumbled that she was just looking. Daniel said that looking and seeing are 2 different things, and that she sees. She said nothing, but for the rest of the day, she worked with redoubled energy. On the 100th day, what Daniel had been waiting for and fearing happened. 5 men appeared on the path to the mill. Not clergymen, not soldiers, mercenaries. Daniel saw them first. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, collecting soil samples. 5 men in leather jackets, carrying short swords and crossbows. They moved silently, professionally. But Sa'a was quieter. She appeared beside Daniel like a shadow. She placed a hand on his shoulder and gently pushed him back, toward the mill. She stepped forward herself. The mercenaries entered the clearing. The leader surveyed the mill. Garden beds, wheat. His gaze settled on Daniel. He said they were from the Grain Merchants Guild, that the guild was offering a deal. A man who knows how to grow crops in the world of Mora is worth a lot, very dearly. The guild is ready to pay, in gold, protection, anything he wants. In return, he goes with them to Southport and works for the guild. Daniel asked what if he refuses. The senior mercenary shrugged. He said that in that case, they would settle the matter quietly, because a man who disrupts grain prices is a threat to business, and the guild does not tolerate threats. She stood between Daniel and the mercenaries. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there, sword in its sheath, hands at her sides, relaxed like a cat before a pounce. The senior mercenary looked at her, assessed her, smirked, said that one woman with a sword wouldn't stop 5 men. EA didn't answer. She was looking at his throat, calmly, without malice, with the expression a butcher uses when looking at a carcass. Where to cut? How quickly? The leader stopped smirking. He had seen that look before. He knew what it meant. A person with that look doesn't bluff. Daniel said he wouldn't go, that he worked here, that if the guild wanted cheap grain, it would have to wait a year. In a year, there would be so much grain that prices would drop on their own, without him. The senior mercenary said the guild wouldn't wait. Daniel said then it would lose. Because killing one agronomist wouldn't stop the famine from ending. The seeds were already in the ground. The knowledge was already in their heads. 5 villages already knew how. You could kill him, but you couldn't kill what he had sown. The senior mercenary was silent. He was thinking. Seah stood motionless. The 2 younger mercenaries were nervous, hands on their hilt. Lyra emerged from the mill. Silian followed her. Behind them was Bran with an axe. Bran stood next to Seah. He toyed with the axe in his hand. He grunted. The senior mercenary did the math. He estimated. An axe. And 5 men behind him who have something to defend. This isn't the deal they promised in Southport. He said he'd be back. He turned and led his men away. Seah saw them off to the edge of the forest. She returned an hour later. She said they'd gone south. Daniel sat on the threshold of the mill, his hands shaking, not from the cold, from the realization. They had just tried to kill him, or kidnap him, which, in this world, amounted to the same thing. Lyra sat down beside him. She said quietly that this was only the beginning, that the guild wouldn't back down. Daniel nodded. He knew. 3 powers, the crown, the church, the guild. They all wanted him, for different reasons, and only one of the 3 could become an ally. He needed the crown. He needed a queen who would sign a document granting him protection, the right to work, the right to teach, the right to feed. Without that document, he was just a target. He looked at Elsa. She was standing by the garden bed, her hands clenching a sickle. Her fingers were white. Her lips were white. She had seen the mercenaries. She had heard the words about a quiet solution. Daniel stood up. He walked over to her. He whispered that everything was okay. Elsa turned to him. Her eyes were wet. Her voice was hoarse. She said that if they came again, she would stand in front of them, because he had taught her that the earth could feed them, and she wouldn't let them take that away. Daniel looked at her freckles, at her white-knuckled fingers gripping the sickle, at her tear-filled eyes. He said that no one would stand in front of anyone, that he would find another way, a way that didn't require bloodshed. Elsa looked at him. She didn't believe him, but she nodded. A month had passed since the mercenaries' visit. Daniel hadn't wasted a single day. He worked 14 hours a day, from dawn till dusk. The breeding plot, the main crops, training the people. He rushed back and forth between the mill and the villages, and every evening collapsed onto the straw like a dead man. The second wheat harvest on the main plot was approaching. The ears were filling out, heavy, full. The second generation wheat from their own seeds was weaker than the first harvest from the packet. He had expected this, split. But even weakened, it was 4 times better than the local varieties. And most importantly, it was clean. Not a spot of gray mold. On the breeding plot, he selected 23 plants out of 150, the best ones, the ones that retained the maximum traits of Cascade 12. Early maturity, thick stem, full ears, clean leaves. 23 out of 150. 15%. Not much, but this was only the second cycle. There would be more in the third, even more in the fourth. The mathematics of breeding are relentless but predictable. He carefully collected seeds from these 23 plants, each grain separately. He marked them. He hid them. This was his future, the future of all of Airvane, if he wasn't exaggerating. Elsa helped with the selection. She was already working independently. Daniel would give her a row and tell her to pick the best ones. She went through them. She marked them. He checked them. Out of her 10 choices, 8 matched his. 2 were debatable. Not a single mistake. He told her that in a year, she would be able to lead the selection process without him. Elsa looked at him fearfully. She asked why without him. Was he going somewhere? Daniel said no. But just in case. The world is dangerous. He might get sick. He might get hurt. Knowledge shouldn't live in just one head. Elsa said nothing, but he could see she understood, and that she didn't like it. A system began to take shape among the villages.
Lyra went from place to place. Holmgreave, Upper Dal, Westmid, Olenau. She inspected the crops, corrected mistakes, taught. She turned out to be a natural teacher, patient, and the peasants listened to her better than they did to Daniel. She spoke their language, not in terms of words, but in terms of understanding.
She knew how to explain why ash was needed, not through soil acidity, but through a simple image. The earth was tired and needed medicine. Ash was that medicine. Cillian wrote every day. Her green table book was growing. Already 3 notebooks made of bound parchment, descriptions of varieties, planting methods, a work calendar, bed layouts. She systematized everything Daniel said, and everything Lyra added from her practical experience. Sometimes, at night, by candlelight, she wrote down other things, her thoughts, her observations, not about plants, about Daniel, about how he stands among the wheat and touches the ears, about how he explains things and his eyes light up, about how he talks to the earth, not out loud, with his hands. She wouldn't let anyone read those pages. She hid them in a separate bundle. But Lyra saw. Lyra saw everything. One evening, she sat down next to Cillian and quietly asked what she was writing. Cillian blushed and pressed the bundle to her chest. Lyra didn't press the issue. She just said quietly that she understood and left. Sa'a stood guard. Every night she patrolled the mill and the nearby forest, quietly, alone, a sword at her belt. She slept 2 or 3 hours a day, and that was enough for her. Daniel tried to get her to sleep more. She brushed him off. She said that on Goryo, guards only sleep when they die. Daniel said that was silly. Sa'a smiled and said, maybe, but she still wouldn't sleep. Once, Daniel asked her for a favor, not about protection. He needed poles for a new greenhouse, straight ones, all the same length, all the same thickness. He said she had the steadiest hand in the abbey. The word abbey just slipped out. He hadn't called the mill that yet, but that's how it came out. Sa'a looked at him, then she nodded. She went into the forest with her sword. She returned 4 hours later. 20 poles lay against the mill wall, each as straight as an arrow, each the same length. The cuts were clean, smooth. The sword cut through the wood more precisely than an axe. Daniel thanked her. Sa'a nodded and walked away. But he noticed. Her eyes were red. She had been cutting the poles for 4 hours and had been crying. Because for the first time in 2 years, her sword was needed for something other than killing. The greenhouse went up in 2 days, a frame of poles, covered with oiled cloth that Lyra had traded for a small bag of dried herbs in Crosstown. Inside the greenhouse, it was 5 or 6 degrees warmer. Daniel planted tomatoes there. Zarya 7, the most valuable packet after wheat. Tomatoes needed warmth, and Airwane was too cold for them in open ground. The greenhouse solved the problem. 25 packets remained. He was waiting for news from the crown. Marin Kalb had left 2 months ago, and since then there had been silence. Daniel didn't know if that was good or bad. Maybe the queen was thinking it over. Maybe the sack of flour had made an impression. Maybe not. He couldn't wait. On the 120th day, he made a decision. He needed a 6th village, then a 7th. The network had to grow. Every new village meant not just mouths to feed, but hands to work. Every trained peasant was a multiplier. If one person taught 10, and each of those 10 taught 10 more, in a year there would be 1,000. In 2 years, 10,000. He sent Lyra and Elsa on a reconnaissance mission. 2 villages to the west, Briarwood and Unhaven, both on the edge of North Earl Province, both dying. Lyra returned in 3 days. She said there were 30 people left in Briarwood. The land is good. The water is clean. The people are desperate but alive, ready to listen to anyone who says they know how to save them.
Elsa returned from Stonehaven. It's worse there. 17 people. The village elder died a month ago. No one is in charge. The fields are overgrown. But there's a south-facing slope by the stream that's perfect for potatoes. Daniel counted out 4 packets, 2 for each village. 21 packets. The box grew lighter with each one. He sent the seeds, with instructions, with people who already knew how. Holmgrave taught Upper Dole. Upper Dole taught Westmid. A chain. Each link passed the knowledge on. Daniel looked at the map on the mill wall and saw 7 dots, 7 green islands. Small, fragile, but connected to one another. On the 130th day, a letter arrived. ManhwaCapped had sent it via a passing merchant who didn't even know what he was carrying. A sealed parchment bearing the royal seal. Daniel broke the seal. He read slowly. The language was formal and flowery, but the gist was simple. Queen Regent Annalise Westmark invited him to the capital for a conversation. She did not order him. She invited him. That was important. An order would have meant soldiers and an escort. An invitation meant that the sack of flour had worked, that the queen wanted to talk, not to take. Attached to the letter was a note from Mirren, informal, in small handwriting on the back. He wrote that Her Majesty had personally baked bread from the flour that had been sent, that she had eaten it alone in her chambers, that she had then sat by the window for an hour in silence, that the next day she had ordered the invitation to be written. Daniel folded the letter. He looked at Sa'a. She was standing at the entrance and already understood. Daniel said he was going to the capital. Sa'a nodded. She said she was going with him. Daniel said he was taking Sa'a and Cillian. Sa'a as a guard, Cillian because he needed a literate person who could write and draft any document. Lyra would stay at the mill. She's in charge while he's away. Elsa is managing the breeding plot. Bran is standing guard. Lyra approached him before they left, silently. She looked at him for a long time. Then she said just one thing. Come back. Daniel said, I'll be back. Lyra nodded. She turned and walked back to the garden beds. They left at dawn. Daniel on a mule that Orn had borrowed from a neighboring village. Sa'a on a horse she'd somehow managed to get herself. Cillian on a second mule with a bag full of parchments. And with them was a cart. On the cart were sacks, flour, potatoes, carrots, and 200 bunches of radishes. Daniel wasn't taking a gift to the capital. He was taking proof. The capital of Westmark was called Kaldheim. Daniel saw it on the 3rd day of the journey, when the road climbed a hill and the city opened up below. Stone walls, towers, bridges across the river, thousands of rooftops. Beautiful. If you didn't look at the people. The people were gray, like the fields, thin, slow. Queues stretched along the streets to the bakeries. Daniel counted 4 such lines as they rode toward the castle. A guard stood at every bakery. People received a single piece of bread, gray, heavy, made from that very same husk they ground and baked, forcing themselves to believe it was food. Cillian watched the lines, and her fingers clenched the edge of her cloak. She had grown up in a monastery and had never seen city hunger. This was different, on a larger scale, more terrifying. The village starved in silence. The city starved loudly. Screams, pushing and shoving in the lines, guards with sticks. A child sat against a wall, gnawing on something dark. Cillian looked closer and turned away. Leather. The child was chewing on a strip of leather from an old belt. Sia rode calmly. She had seen worse. But her hand rested on the hilt of her sword and did not move. They rode up to the castle. The gates opened. ManhwaCapped was waiting for them in the courtyard. He looked tired, dark circles under his eyes. He had lost weight since their last meeting. He looked at the cart, at the sacks, then at Daniel. He nodded, led them inside. The castle was cold and empty. The tapestries on the walls had faded, half the candles weren't lit. They were economizing. Even the crown was economizing. They were led into a hall, a large one, stone, a long table in the middle. 3 people sat at the table, a woman in the center. To her right, a gray-haired man in a robe. To her left, a soldier with a bandaged arm. The woman in the center was young, 24 years old, pale, slender hands resting on the armrests of her chair. A simple dark dress without adornments. The crown on her head was small and dull, but her back was straight. Her chin was lifted. Her eyes were gray and attentive, like a winter morning. Annalise Westmark, Queen Regent. Daniel stood before the table. He bowed, not deeply, enough to show respect, not enough to show submission. Annalise looked at him in silence. 10 seconds, 20. She studied him as he had studied the field, intently, systematically. Then she said she had baked the bread from his flour herself, that she hadn't trusted the cooks, that she had kneaded the dough with her own hands. She raised her palms and showed him, slender fingers, white skin, but under her fingernails he saw traces of flour. She hadn't washed them off completely, on purpose, so he would see. She said that this bread was the first white bread in Kaldheim in 2 years. A gray-haired man in a robe coughed. It was Chancellor Rolf Ashen. He said that bread was nice, but they weren't here for pleasantries. They were here to understand what this man was capable of and what he wanted. The soldier with the bandaged arm nodded. It was Marshal Connor Grant. He said that the Northern Earl was starving, that the province had lost 1/3 of its population in 3 years, that caravans from the south were being robbed on the roads, that there was only 2 months' worth of grain left. He wanted to know one thing. Could Daniel feed the Northern Earl? All of them. 200,000 people. Daniel was silent. He was counting in his head. 200,000. At a minimum ration of half a kilo of grain per person per day, that's 100 tons of grain a day. 36,000 tons a year. His 7 villages produced a ton so far, maybe 2. The gap was monstrous. He couldn't lie. Lying would mean signing his own death warrant when the truth came out. But saying no meant losing his chance. He told the truth. He said he couldn't do it now, that his seeds were limited, that he needed 3 years to stabilize the varieties. But in a year, he could feed 20,000. In 2 years, 50,000. In 3, all 200,000, if they let him work. Chancellor Ashen grimaced. He said that in 3 years, North Earl would be a graveyard, that a decision was needed now. Daniel said that there was no solution now, not for him, not for the Druids, not for the church, not for anyone. But there would be a solution in a year, and he was the only one offering it. Marshal Grant tapped the table with his healthy hand. He said, "All right, what does he need?" Daniel was ready for this question. He'd been preparing his answer for the entire 3-day journey. He said he needed a base. Not a mill in the woods, but a real base, with land, with buildings, with defenses. He said he'd heard of the abandoned Abbey of St. Brim, 20 miles north of Kaldheim. Large, stone, with farmland all around. Empty since the beginning of the Moor. He wants St. Brim. The Chancellor said the Abbey belongs to the church. Daniel said the church isn't using it. Annalisa raised her hand. Everyone fell silent. She said the Abbey would be his. The Chancellor opened his mouth. Annalisa looked at him, and the Chancellor shut his mouth. She said that besides the Abbey, what else? Daniel said he needed a document, an official one, a royal one that gives him the right to work the land without the church's sanction, the right to teach the peasants, the right to distribute seeds, the right to defend his fields from anyone who comes to take them away. He said this document could be called the Green Edict. Annalise was silent. She looked at him, and he could see her mind working, quickly, precisely. She was weighing the consequences. The church would be furious. The lords would be displeased. The guild would go wild. But if there was bread in a year's time, none of that would matter. Because whoever feeds the people rules them, and if she stood beside the man who fed the people, she would stand firmer than any lord. She said she would sign, but not now. She would sign when he showed results not to 7 villages, but to the capital, when the people of Kaldheim saw his bread. Then she would sign before their very eyes, and no one would dare to challenge it. Daniel understood. She was giving him a deadline and a condition, public proof. She was smarter than he'd expected, much smarter. He said, "All right." She nodded. Then she leaned forward and whispered, just for him. She said that her lords considered her a weak girl on the throne, that every morning she woke up thinking she wouldn't make it, that a sack of flour was the first thing in a year that made her believe she could survive. She said this without a tremor in her voice, without tears, steadily, like a fact. Daniel took a loaf of bread out of his bag, baked before he left. He placed it on the table in front of her. He said this bread was baked in a village where a year ago they were eating grass. That if she signed the edict, in a year's time it would be like this in every village of her kingdom. That he was giving her not flattery, but a tool. Annalisa looked at the bread, at his hands that had placed this bread there, at his face. She reached out and touched the crust with her fingertips. It was still warm. Marin had wrapped it in a cloth before the meeting. She said quietly that she believed him and that he would receive the abbey in a week. They left the hall. Cillian walked beside them, scribbling in a notebook. She wrote down every word, every gesture, every pause. Seah walked behind them, silent. As they exited the castle, Marin caught up with them. He pulled Daniel aside. He said quietly that a man to be feared was heading north. Inquisitor Calder Morn, Senior Inquisitor of the Church of the Bright Mother. He already knows about Daniel. He's traveling with 24 purifiers, and he's not the type to talk. Daniel asked how long it would take. Mirren said 2 months, maybe 3. It depends on the roads. Daniel nodded. 2 months. That would be enough for him. It had to be enough. They spent the night at the castle. In the morning, they set out again. A parchment bearing the royal seal now lay on the cart. A temporary charter for St. Brim Abbey. Not an edict, but a start. On the way home, Celine quietly asked him if he was afraid of the Inquisitor. Daniel looked at the road ahead. Gray. Empty. He said he was afraid, but not of the Inquisitor. He was afraid he wouldn't make it in time. Chapter summary. Daniel met with Queen Annalisa in the capital of Kaldheim and agreed to receive St. Brim Abbey. Annalisa promised to sign the Green Edict publicly once Daniel presented the results to the capital. Marin warned that the Inquisitor Calder Morn was heading the north with a detachment of purifiers. Daniel has 2 or 3 months. St. Brim Abbey stood on the hill like a stone fist. Massive. Gray. With thick walls and a caved-in roof over the west wing. Fields lay around it. Abandoned. Gray. But Daniel looked at them and saw something else. He saw soil. Dark. Deep. For centuries, the monks had fertilized this land. Compost. Manure. Ash. They didn't know the word humus, but they had created it. Even 3 years of the gray mold hadn't killed this soil completely. It was sleeping, waiting. Daniel knelt down at the edge of the nearest field. He scooped up a handful of soil, rubbed it between his fingers, sniffed it. Better than at the mill, much better. pH around 6, almost neutral. Loose structure, earthworms. He saw an earthworm in a clump of soil and almost laughed. Worms meant life, meant the soil wasn't dead, meant they could work here. He stood up and turned around. The whole team was standing behind him. Lyra, Elsa, Cillian, Sa'a, Bran, Finn. Oren had come too. The old man stood leaning on his cane, looking at the abbey, then at Daniel, then at the fields. He said quietly that it was beautiful here. Daniel nodded. It was beautiful here. And there would be a school here. The first week was spent getting settled. Bran oversaw the repairs. He found 3 masons and 2 carpenters among the refugees who were flocking to the abbey. People came every day, one by one, in pairs, in families. They had heard. Rumors of the Green Man had spread throughout Northern Earl. People came to him as their last hope. Daniel couldn't take everyone in. It broke his heart, but he couldn't. Every extra mouth to feed meant supplies were dwindling faster. He set a rule. Whoever comes must work. No food. Not out of cruelty. It was simple math. If 100 people eat and 20 work, the food will run out in a month. If 100 people eat and 100 work, the food will never run out. He organized work crews. One repaired the walls, another cleared the fields, a third dug a well, a fourth built greenhouses, a fifth prepared compost. Lyra led the women, gathering herbs, preparing decoctions, treating the sick, and there were many sick people. Scurvy, rickets, night blindness, skin ulcers from vitamin deficiency. Lyra walked among the beds set up in the east wing and handed out carrot juice and herbal infusions. Silene recorded the symptoms and treatments, every case, every dose, every result. The green table book was turning into a medical reference. Elsa took charge of the fields. She laid out the garden beds with a precision that amazed Daniel. Even, parallel, spaced just right. She commanded men twice her age and 3 times her weight, and they obeyed. Not because she was Oren's daughter, because she knew what she was doing, and they could see it. Daniel launched a large-scale planting. All the remaining packets went into the ground. 21. He counted every one. Wheat in the main field, potatoes on the northern slope, carrots and beets in the greenhouses, peas along the abbey walls, cabbage in the beds by the well, Zarya 7 tomatoes in the 4 large greenhouses Bran had built, radishes in the quick-grow beds for immediate human consumption. He left himself 0 packets. Everything is in the ground. Everything is on the line. Now his only reserve is the seed stock from the breeding plots. The 3rd generation of wheat from 23 selected plants. He planted them on a separate plot behind the abbey wall, fenced it off, locked it up. No one but him and Elsa had access there. It was the holy of holies, the future of the Homegrave 1 variety. If this crop yields at least 30% stable plants with the desired traits, he's on the right track. If less than 20, he would need another cycle. And there might not be time for another cycle. At the same time, Daniel set about the task he had been putting off: canning. He knew the theory: sterilization in boiling water, airtight sealing, storage in a cool place. The problem was the containers. He needed glass jars. Glass existed in Airwain, expensive, fragile, cloudy, but it existed. He sent Mirin Kalb, who now came every 2 weeks with messages from the Queen, to the glassmaker in Kaldheim. An order for 200 wide-mouthed jars with ground-in lids. The glassmaker quoted a price that made Mirin turn pale. Annalisa paid for it out of her own pocket, without explaining it to the treasurer. While the jars were being made, Daniel taught Lyra and Cillian. He showed them how to make tomato sauce, how to braise meat until tender, how to sterilize the jars with boiling water, how to fill and seal them so that no air got inside. Cillian wrote down every step. Lyra tried it out. The first 10 jars burst from the temperature shock. Daniel made adjustments. He showed them how to heat the jar gradually. The next 10 held up. They began canning. The Zarya 7 tomatoes were the first to ripen. Red, large, juicy, the size of an adult man's fist. Bran took one in his hand and twirled it like a curiosity. He had never seen a tomato. They didn't have them on the Airwain. It was a new vegetable, a new taste, a new world on the tongue. Daniel cut the tomato in half and let everyone try it. Lyra chewed slowly with her eyes closed. Cillian took a bite and her eyebrows shot up. Sa'a tasted it and nodded. Briefly, approvingly. Finn ate a whole one and asked for more. Elsa took a bite and juice ran down her chin. She wiped it with her hand and laughed. Daniel looked at her, at the juice on her chin, at her laughter, at her freckles. Then he turned away, down to business. They canned every day. Tomatoes, cucumbers that had grown from the seeds in the third packet, stewed meat that Sa'a had hunted in the forest. Each jar was sealed and carried down to the Abbey cellar. Daniel counted. 1 jar was 1 serving for 2 people. 200 jars was 400 servings. Not enough. Insignificantly little for what he was planning. But he wasn't planning to feed the entire Northern Earl with these jars. He was planning something else. He was planning a miracle. A small, man-made, controllable miracle. On the 170th day, he was informed that people in gray robes had appeared on the southern road. Many of them, 24. With them were horsemen, Inquisitor Calder Morn. Sooner than Mirren had predicted. A month earlier. Daniel stood on the Abbey wall and looked south. A gray ribbon of road, dots on it, approaching. Sa'a stood beside him, her hand on her sword. Daniel told her that swords wouldn't help. 20 purifiers aren't the same as 5 mercenaries, and the church stands behind them. Killing the Inquisitor means war with the church. They can't afford that. Sa'a asked, what then? Daniel looked at the fields surrounding the Abbey. Green. The wheat stood like a wall. Potato tops darkened on the northern slope. Tomatoes blushed in the greenhouses. He said he had 1 day to prepare. He climbed down from the wall and began giving orders, quickly, clearly. Everyone had their own task. Elsa was gathering wheat from the nearby field, all of it, down to the last ear. Lyra was preparing the kitchen. Cillian was preparing documents. Bran and the men were building tables in the Abbey courtyard, long ones, made of planks and trestles, as many as would fit. Sa'a was to stand at the gate and not get in the way, just stand there, with a sword, in silence. Let them see that he was not defenseless, but not a threat either. The Abbey stayed awake all night. They ground grain on hand mills. They kneaded dough. They baked. Lyra and Cillian and 10 women stood by the ovens. Loaf after loaf, round, golden, plump. The smell of bread wafted over the Abbey and drifted into the night. By morning, rows of fresh bread lay on long tables in the courtyard, 200 loaves. Beside them stood baskets of tomatoes, with carrots, with potatoes, with radishes. The Abbey courtyard looked like a banquet hall. Amidst a gray, hungry world, Daniel stood in the middle of it all and waited. Calder Morn rode through the Abbey gates at dawn, tall, lean, a face carved from stone, eyes dark and deep, gray hair cut short. The Inquisitor's gray robe, cinched with a leather belt, no sword or dagger on the belt, only rosary beads. 22 purifiers followed him, young, strong. These ones had swords. They entered the courtyard and stopped. Calder looked at the tables, at the bread, at the baskets of vegetables, at the scent that hung in the air thick and warm. His face didn't change. He dismounted. He walked over to the nearest table. He picked up a loaf. He turned it over in his hands, sniffed it, put it back. He turned to Daniel. Daniel stood 10 paces away, alone, unarmed, hands at his sides. Sa'a stood by the wall to the right, Bran to the left, but far away, not threatening. Calder spoke. His voice was low, steady, without malice. He said he hadn't come for bread. That bread was Thing, and he had come for the truth. He asked who had given Daniel the right to grow crops without the mother's blessing. Who had given him the right to teach the peasants without the church's sanction? Who had given him the right to call knowledge what the church calls heresy? Daniel answered quietly. He said that hunger had given him the right, that when people are dying and the land is dead, there is no time to wait for a blessing.
Calder did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. This made him more terrifying than any loudmouth. He said that hunger was a trial, that the Bright Mother had sent the Gray Plague not to kill, but to purify, that people should pray and repent, not run to a stranger with a sack of seeds, that Daniel was replacing faith with knowledge, and thereby taking away the only thing the people had left, their hope in the Mother. Daniel listened. He didn't interrupt. He could see that Calder believed every word. This was no villain. This was a man who had seen the Gray Plague kill his sister and nephews, and the only explanation he could find was faith. Take away his faith, and all that remains is pain and emptiness. Daniel understood that, and that was exactly why he didn't argue. He said he didn't dispute the Mother, that he didn't tell people to stop praying, that prayer was their business and their right, but that while they prayed, their children could eat,
and one didn't interfere with the other.
Calder looked at him for a long time. Then he said that it did interfere, that a person who eats their fill stops praying, that satiety kills faith faster than any heresy, that Daniel wasn't just feeding people, he was taking the Mother away from them. Daniel remained silent, because there was a grain of truth in Calder's logic. Well-fed people do pray less often than the hungry. That was true on Earth, too. But it didn't follow that people should go hungry. They stood facing each other, the Inquisitor and the agronomist. The courtyard smelled of bread and was silent. The purifiers stood in formation. Daniel's team stood along the walls. Between them lay tables laden with food. Calder said he would take Daniel to Kaldheim for a church trial. The court would decide. If the Mother was on his side, he would be acquitted. If not, he would be purified by fire. Daniel nodded. He said, "All right." Everyone around them froze.
Shea took a step forward.
Daniel raised his hand. He stopped her. He looked at Calder and stated one condition. The trial must be public. In the square of Kaldheim, in front of the people. Calder narrowed his eyes. He asked why. Daniel said because the truth fears no witnesses. Calder was silent for 10 seconds. Then he nodded. A public trial, in the square, in front of the people. He agreed because he was certain he was right, and because a public condemnation of a heretic would strengthen the faith more than a quiet burning. Before leaving, Daniel took Elsa aside. He quietly told her what to do while he was gone. The selection plot was the most important thing. The third generation was nearing harvest. In 2 weeks, they would need to make a selection. She knew how. She'll manage. Elsa grabbed his hand. Her fingers were cold, pale. She said he shouldn't go, that Calder would burn him, that the trial was a trap. Daniel said it wasn't a trap. He said Calder was an honest man. A fanatic, but honest. If the trial was public, he couldn't just burn him without evidence. And there was no evidence of heresy. There was only bread. Elsa wouldn't let go of his hand. Daniel said quietly that he would return. She looked into his eyes. He saw in them everything she couldn't say. 3 months of working together, shoulder to shoulder over the garden beds, hands touching over the planting hole, a silence that spoke louder than words. She let go of his hand, stepped back, nodded. He rode off with Calder. Sa'a rode beside them. Silian followed behind her, and behind them came the wagon, that very same wagon, but now it was carrying more, sacks of flour, baskets of vegetables, and 200 glass jars of preserves, every single one. Daniel had taken the entire supply. Lyra had tried to stop him,
She'd said that if the court lost, it would all be lost. Daniel said that if the court lost, they would all be lost. So it was better to use everything. The journey to Kaldheim took 2 days. Calder rode ahead and said nothing. He didn't speak to Daniel. He didn't look in his direction. He prayed. Quietly. Monotonously. The rosary beads clicked between his fingers like dry bones. During the first night's rest stop, Daniel sat down by the purifier's campfire. They tensed up. He raised his hands. He said he just wanted to talk. He asked the senior purifier how long it had been since he'd eaten white bread. The purifier said nothing. Daniel took a loaf out of his bag, broke it in half, held it out. The purifier looked at the bread, at Daniel, at Calder, who sat off to the side and prayed. Then he took it, took a bite, chewed, closed his eyes. Other purifiers sat nearby, young men, hungry, all of them hungry. 3 years of famine had spared not even the church. Daniel handed out the bread, a piece to each. Silence, without a word. Calder saw it. He didn't stop it. But his rosary beads clicked faster. Kaldheim greeted them with rain, gray and cold. The square was ready. ManhwaCapped had made sure of it. A platform in the center, benches for the judges, a place for the accused, and thousands of people. They stood in the rain and waited, thin, gray, with wide eyes. Daniel remembered the girl who was chewing on her belt. He remembered the lines at the bakeries. He remembered Annalise's face as she touched the crust of the bread with her fingertips. He stood on the platform and looked at the crowd. Thousands of faces. Thousands of hungry faces. And he knew he had brought enough. The trial began at noon. The rain had stopped. A pale sun broke through the clouds. Calder Morn stood on the platform and spoke. He spoke for an hour. His voice was steady and strong. He spoke of the Light Mother, about her will, about the gray sea as a purification, about the pride of people who decided they could do without prayer, about the stranger who came from who knows where with unknown seeds and unknown knowledge, about how knowledge without faith is poison, about how bread baked without a blessing is poison for the soul. He spoke beautifully, convincingly. Every word fell on the crowd like a stone. People listened. They nodded. Many of them believed. 3 years of prayers had seeped into their bones. For 3 years they had been told to endure, and the mother would save them. And here stood a man saying the same thing, loudly, confidently, with the authority of the Inquisitor behind him. Daniel listened and did not interrupt. He stood on the platform with his hands bound. Calder insisted. The accused must be bound. Tradition. Seah stood at the foot of the platform, her hand on the hilt, her eyes on the purifiers. Cillian sat in the front row and took notes, every word. Annalisa watched from the castle balcony. Chancellor Ashen and Marshal Grant stood beside her. She did not intervene. She could not. The Inquisition was outside the Crown's jurisdiction, but she was here, and that meant she was watching and waiting. Calder finished. He turned to Daniel. He said the accused had the right to speak. Daniel looked at the crowd. Thousands of faces, hungry, waiting. He could speak. He could present arguments. He could explain about nitrogen and phosphorus, about breeding and crop rotation, about fungi and resistance. He could have spoken for an hour like Calder. But they wouldn't have understood. Not because they were stupid, because they were hungry. A hungry person doesn't hear words. They hear only the smell of food. Daniel didn't say a word. He looked at Sa'a and nodded. Sa'a whistled. From the alley behind the square, the very same one. The crowd parted. The cart drove into the square and stopped by the platform. Lyra jumped down from it. Elsa followed her. Daniel blinked. He hadn't expected Elsa. She was supposed to stay at the selection site. But she was here. She'd come on her own. She couldn't stay. Lyra and Elsa began unloading sacks from the cart. Baskets, jars. They arranged everything on the long tables that Marin had set up in advance around the edges of the square. They took bread out of the sacks. vegetables from the baskets, tomatoes, carrots, potatoes. They poured tomato sauce and stewed meat from the jars into bowls. The smell wafted across the square. Warm, rich, unbelievable. The crowd stirred. 1,000 hungry people turned their heads at once, toward the tables, toward the bread, toward the scent. And Silene jumped down from the cart. She stood in the square in her nun's habit, pale, slender, with ink-stained fingers. And she began to hand out bread into everyone's hands, a warm loaf, fresh, plump, white. The very same Silene who had fled the church, the very same novice they had wanted to burn. She stood in the square in the habit of the bright mother and handed out bread. Lyra stood next to her, the widow of the burned herbalist. She handed out tomatoes, red, juicy, to everyone's hands. Elsa stood nearby, a farmer's daughter, hands in the soil. She handed out potatoes, hot, boiled, flaky. People took them and couldn't believe it. They held them to their noses, sniffed, then bit into them, and the square began to eat. Quietly at first, then louder. Then the square began to cry. An old woman in the front row, small, hunchbacked, in a gray shawl. She took a loaf with both hands, pressed it to her face, sniffed it, then took a bite, chewed. White bread. For the first time in 3 years. Tears ran down her wrinkles and fell onto the crust. She chewed and cried, and it was so quiet and so loud at the same time that the square froze. Daniel turned to Calder. The Inquisitor stood there, looking at the old woman. His face. Daniel remembered that face, stony, unmoving. But the eyes. Something was breaking in Calder's eyes, slowly, painfully, like ice on a river on the first day of spring, a crack that cannot be stopped. Daniel spoke, quietly, just for Calder. He said that if this was heresy, then let the Bright Mother take the bread from their hands right now. If not, then let them eat. Calder didn't answer. He looked at the old woman. She had finished her loaf and reached for a second one. Her hands were shaking. A child stood next to her, a boy of about 5. He was eating a tomato, and red juice was running down his shirt. He didn't know what it was. He just ate and laughed, because it tasted good. Calder Morn slowly stepped down from the platform. Every step was heavy, as if his legs were carrying him against his will. He approached the old woman. She looked up at him. There was no fear in her eyes, only tears, and breadcrumbs on her lips. Calder dropped to one knee. Not before Daniel, before her, before the old woman holding a loaf of bread. He raised his hand and made the sign of the cross on her forehead, slowly, as he had done 1,000 times, but for the first time in 3 years, not with words of repentance, with words of blessing. The square was silent. 1,000 people, not a sound, only the wind. And the smell of bread. Calder stood up. He turned toward the platform. He looked at Daniel. For a long time. Then he said the trial was over, that the charges were dropped, that this man was not a heretic. The purifiers behind him exchanged glances. Calder turned and walked across the square, alone, without an entourage. His back was straight, but his shoulders were slumped. He walked like a man who had just lost something and found something else and didn't know which was more painful. Daniel stood on the platform. His hands were still bound. Sa'a leaped onto the platform and cut the ropes with a single motion. Daniel rubbed his wrists. He looked up at the castle balcony. Annalisa was standing there, alone. The Chancellor and the Marshal had left. She looked at him. Then she nodded slowly. He nodded back. She walked down to the square, alone, without guards. She made her way through the crowd, which parted for her, to the cart. Marin handed her a quill and an inkwell. Cillian unfolded the parchment on the cart's lid.
Annalisa signed the green edict in the square, on the cart's cover, before 1,000 witnesses. The quill scratched, the seal pressed onto the parchment. The crowd didn't understand what had happened. They were eating. But they would find out tomorrow, in a week, in a year. They would find out that on this day, in this square, their queen had signed a document that would change everything. Daniel stood nearby and watched as Annalisa handed over the quill. She turned to him. She said quietly that now he must keep his promise. A year, every village, bread. Daniel said, "I will." The sun broke through the clouds and flooded the square with light. The crowd ate and wept. Elsa stood by the cart and looked at him across the square. Lyra handed out the last tomatoes. Cillian folded the parchment. Sa'a stood with her sword in its sheath and smiled for the first time in 2 years. And somewhere, in the back rows of the crowd, hidden by her hood, stood a woman. She wasn't eating. She was watching Daniel, intently, coldly. Then she turned and walked away. No one took notice. After the trial, everything accelerated. The Green Edict gave Daniel what he hadn't had before: legal authority. Now he could work openly. He could teach. He could distribute seeds, and no one could arrest him for it. Not the church, not the barons, not the guild. The royal seal was on the parchment, and that was enough. He returned to St. Brim Abbey and began to build a school. Not a building. The building was already there. A school as a system. He gathered people from all 7 villages, 2 from each, 14 people, men and women, young and old. All those who knew how to listen and wanted to learn. He seated them at a long table in the Abbey's main hall and told them they would study for 2 months, every day. Theory from dawn until noon. From noon until sunset, practice in the field. After 2 months, everyone would return to their village and train 10 more people. In 6 months, he would have 140 trained farmers. In a year, more than 1,000. Elsa led the practical sessions. She stood in front of 14 students in the field and demonstrated how to mark out the beds, how to determine soil acidity by the weeds, how to plant, how to hill up the plants, how to select the best plants. She spoke confidently, without a hitch. Daniel stood to the side and watched. A year ago, she had considered herself a simple peasant girl. Now she was teaching others, and she did it better than he did, because she spoke their language. Lyra taught a course on medicinal plants. Cillian transcribed the teaching materials. The green table book had turned into a valuable manual. 5 notebooks, with drawings, with tables, with step-by-step instructions. Cillian copied out copies for every village, by hand, at night, by candlelight. Her fingers were always covered in ink, and she had stopped noticing it. Shea trained the guards, 10 men from among the refugees. Not an army, a militia, but with swords and discipline. She put them through their paces every morning before dawn, and they hated her and adored her at the same time. 3 weeks after the trial, a girl came to the abbey, small, round-faced, with tousled bangs and a notebook pressed to her chest. She spoke with a soft southern accent and introduced herself as Yuna So, the daughter of the ambassador of the coastal republic of Hanum. She said her father had sent her in secret, that the gray mold was moving south, that in a year it would reach the rice fields of Hanum, that her father couldn't sleep at night, that he had heard about the green man from North Earl and sent his daughter to learn. Daniel looked at her. Young, 20 years old. The notebook in her hands was open, and she was already taking notes. He hadn't said a word yet, and she was already writing. He asked what she had brought with her. Yuna opened her bag and took out some small bags, rice samples, 6 varieties, with detailed descriptions, in the henna language and in the common tongue. Each variety listed its region of origin and cultivation characteristics. Daniel took 1 small bag. He poured a handful of grains into his palm, long, thin, white. He rolled them between his fingers, sniffed them, rubbed one between his fingers, starchy, dense, good genetics. He asked Yuna if their rice was diseased. She said not yet, that gray mold hadn't reached them yet, but the spores were getting closer. Daniel thought, rice. He didn't specialize in rice. Wheat and tomatoes were his field. But he knew the basic genetics of grains, and he knew one thing that Yuna didn't.
Rice, by its very biology, had a natural resistance to fungi of the Fusarium class. Gray mold was the closest to Fusarium in terms of the type of infection. If his hunch was correct, the rice varieties from Hanum might be nearly immune to the mold. Moreover, if he crossed the resistance traits from rice genetics with his wheat through proper selection, he could enhance the resistance of the new varieties. Not directly. Rice and wheat do not crossbreed, but through an understanding of the mechanisms, through parallel breeding. By studying why one species is resistant and another is not. He looked at Yuna and told her what changed her expression. He said that her rice was nearly immune to gray mold, that they didn't need to save it, that they needed to understand why it was resistant and apply that principle to wheat, that she had brought him not a problem, but a solution. Yuna looked at him. Her lips trembled. Her eyes filled with tears. She pressed the notebook to her chest and cried, quietly, out of relief. 2 months on the road, fear for her homeland, her father's sleepless nights, and one man says that everything will be fine, that the answer is already in her hands. Lyra walked over and put her arms around Yuna's shoulders. Yuna cried and kept saying she was sorry. Lyra told her there was nothing to apologize for, that everyone here had cried. It was normal. Yuna joined the team that very day. She worked like a woman possessed. She wrote everything down, every word Daniel said, every observation Lyra made, every lesson from Elsa, notebook after notebook. She could talk for 2 hours about the differences between rice varieties, and Daniel listened because her chatter contained nuggets of knowledge he himself lacked. Meanwhile, the 3rd generation of wheat in the breeding plot had ripened. Daniel and Elsa inspected every plant. Of the 230 seedlings, 71 met the criteria, 30%. Early maturity preserved, thick stem, full ear, clean leaves. Resistance to mildew confirmed, 30%. Growth from 15 to 30 in a single generation. The math worked. 1 more cycle and it will be 50 to 60. 1 more and 70 to 80, a stable variety. Daniel selected seeds from the best 71 plants, carefully, every grain. This was the 4th generation stock. If the 4th generation yields 60% or higher, he'll name it Homegrave -1 and begin mass propagation. An open pollinated variety, seeds that can be sown again and again, forever. He poured these seeds into a small bag and stashed it in a secret compartment in the wall. Then he sat down against the wall and closed his eyes, tired. For the first time ever, he allowed himself to feel tired. His body ached, his back, his knees, his hands. He had been working every day, from dawn until 2 in the afternoon, for over a year now. No days off, no rest, without stopping, because stopping meant death for someone. Elsa found him there, sleeping by the wall, sitting with a small bag of seeds in his hand. She took off her jacket and draped it over his shoulders. He didn't wake up. She sat down beside him, quietly. She didn't leave. She just sat there, watching over his sleep. Lyra walked by. She saw them. She stopped. She looked. Then she quietly walked away. She was smiling. That very smile Daniel had seen once, warm and open. Winter of the 2nd year came early. Snow fell in early November, and St. Brim Abbey became a white island in a white world. But inside, it was warm. The stoves were burning. In the storerooms lay sacks of potatoes and flour. In the cellar stood 200 new cans of preserves in rows. The first batch had been distributed in Kaldheim Square.
Daniel had been preparing the second all summer and fall. Lyra and Cillian worked on it like a factory. Tomatoes, cucumbers, stew. Every can was sealed and signed by Cillian's hand. The abbey now fed not 7 villages, but 14. The first wave of students had returned to their villages and got to work. Each had trained 10 others. Daniel did the math. 140 trained farmers. 20,000 people in the province gained access to new methods. Not yet to new seeds, to methods. Proper watering, ash, crop rotation, compost. That alone was enough to increase the yield of local varieties by 40%. Not threefold as with his seeds, but by 40%. The difference between life and death. The famine in North Earl hadn't officially ended, but people had stopped dying, stopped eating bark and leather, stopped fighting in lines. The gray sea still lay across the fields, but now people knew they could fight it, not with prayer, with work. In December, Daniel planted the 4th generation of wheat, in greenhouses, a winter crop, risky, but the greenhouses Bran had built held the heat. Oil-soaked cloth stretched over a frame of poles cut down by the Sa'a. Inside, it was 10 degrees warmer than outside. The wheat sprouted a week later. It grew more slowly than in the summer, but it grew. By February, he saw the results. Of the 180 plants, 112 met the criteria, 62%. Daniel stood in the greenhouse and counted. He recounted them. He counted again. 62. Not 50, not 40, 62. The mathematics of breeding had not failed him. A jump from 30 to 62 in a single generation. He sat right down on the ground between the rows. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, from what he had realized. One more cycle. One. The spring planting of the 5th generation would yield 80 or more. This was a stable variety. This was Homegrave 1. This was the end of dependence on his terminal seeds. This was the beginning of a world in which farmers fed themselves. He closed his eyes and saw what had warmed him that night. The old woman in the distant village. She has so many carrots, she doesn't know who to give them to. Elsa walked into the greenhouse and saw him on the ground. She was startled. She ran over. He opened his eyes, looked up at her, said 2 words. 62. Elsa didn't understand. Then she did. Her eyes filled with tears. She sat down next to him on the ground, right in the mud. They sat side by side among the green wheat in the winter greenhouse and were silent. Then Elsa rested her head on his shoulder, gently, carefully, like placing a fragile thing on a fragile shelf. Daniel didn't move. They sat like that for a long time, a minute, 5, 10. Between them lay everything that had accumulated over the year. Their shared labor, the garden beds, the planting holes, the touch of their hands, the silence. Now it was no longer silence. It had become something else. That evening, a caravan pulled up to the abbey. 200 people. Refugees from the east. Children. Old people. All on their last legs. Snow, frost, night. The storekeeper ran to Daniel in a panic, said there wouldn't be enough food for everyone for the night, that the supplies were calculated, that 200 extra mouths to feed was a disaster. Daniel stood up silently. He went to the basement, alone. The staircase down, a cold stone corridor, and shelves, 200 glass jars, in rows, neatly arranged, each one labeled by Cillian's hand. Tomatoes, cucumbers, canned meat, summer in a jar. He stood before them. He had prepared them all year long, for a situation he hoped would never come to pass. It had come to pass. He began carrying the jars upstairs, 4 at a time. He carried them up the stairs. He set them on the long monastery tables in the main hall. Lyra saw and silently joined him, then Cillian, then Sa'a, then Yuna, then Bran, then Elsa. They carried the jars from the basement and placed them on the tables, in rows, 200 jars on long wooden tables. The glass shimmered in the candlelight. Inside, red tomatoes and dark stewed meat and green cucumbers, the colors of summer in the middle of walls. The refugees were led into the hall. They entered and stopped at the threshold. They looked at the tables, at the jars, at the candles, at the faces of the people waiting for them. Daniel personally opened the first jar, tomatoes in their own juice. The scent wafted through the hall. Warm, summery, impossible in February. He took a spoon, looked around the hall, saw a little girl. She was standing by the door, clinging to her mother. Thin, pale, eyes huge. He walked over to her, crouched down, held out the spoon with a tomato, quietly told her to eat, said it was summer in a jar. He said he'd saved it for her. The girl looked at the spoon, at him, at her mother. Her mother nodded. The girl opened her mouth. She tasted it. Her face changed, slowly. Surprise. Then something else. Something children sense more easily than adults. Delicious. Just delicious. She reached for a second spoonful. The audience watched. 200 people and the whole crew. Silence. Then the girl smiled, and the room exhaled and began to cry, quietly. The way people cry who have cried too much and are no longer shy about it. Lyra was handing out food. Cylian was pouring. Elsa was slicing bread. Sia was carrying bowls. Yuna wrote down the name of every refugee in a notebook so that no one would be forgotten. Bran stood by the door and made sure everyone came in and no one was left out in the cold. Oren sat in the corner and said nothing. The old man looked out at the room, and his face was wet. This night would later be called the Night of the Glass Summer, for 30 years. How 200 people came who were waiting for death. And how, instead of death, they found a can of tomatoes and a spoon, and a man who said, "Eat." After the last refugee fell asleep in the warmth, Daniel went down to the basement. Alone. Empty shelves. 200 empty spots on the shelves. A supply that was gone. He stood in the empty basement and thought about how he now had nothing with which to meet the next caravan. But he had no regrets, not for a second. He went upstairs. Sa'a was waiting for him in the hallway, silently. She handed him a mug of hot broth. He took it. She said quietly that they would need 3 times as many greenhouses by spring, that she would chop some poles. Daniel nodded. They stood in the dark hallway and drank the hot liquid. Behind the wall, 200 people were snoring, warm, well-fed, alive. At dawn, Daniel went out into the courtyard. The snow crunched under his feet. The cold air stung his lungs. He walked toward the greenhouse, toward the 4th generation of wheat that would decide everything. He opened the canopy and stepped inside. Warm, humid air, rows of green. The ears were already forming. He walked along the rows, touching every stalk, a habit, a ritual, a check. Everything was in place. Everything was growing. In the spring, he would sow the 5th generation and obtain a stable variety. In a year, Holmgrave 1 wheat would be in every village of Northern Earl. In 2 years, in every village of Westmark. In 3 years, across the entire continent. The farmers would sow their own seeds, without him, forever. He stepped out of the greenhouse and stopped. Lying in the snow was an object that shouldn't have been there. A notebook. Thin, leather-bound. He picked it up, opened it. English, his native language. Handwritten text. A woman's handwriting. Neat, small. He read the first line and the world swayed.
The fungus has taken hold well. In 2 seasons, will burn the northern provinces. He turned the page. The entries continued. Dates, observations, strains, mutations. Someone had been keeping a lab journal. Detailed. Professional. Someone who knew mycology at a level no lower than a master's degree. Someone who, 3 years ago, had deliberately bred and spread gray mold. He flipped through the pages. His hands were shaking. The penultimate page, a note in the margins. He wasn't supposed to survive. He wasn't supposed to end up here. But since he was here, he'd have to adapt the plan. The last page, a photograph, faded, crumpled, but recognizable. A woman in a lab coat against the backdrop of a greenhouse. Chestnut hair, thin-framed glasses, a smile. He knew that face. 5 years side by side at the same company. 5 years in neighboring labs, 5 years of lunches in the same cafeteria. Dr. Helen Price, senior mycologist, fusarium specialist, the one who quit a year before his death, the one they said had left for South America, the one no one was looking for. Daniel stood in the snow with a notebook in his hands, and the world was shifting around him. Gray mold is man-made. Helen Price created it and brought it to Airway, deliberately, methodically, professionally. She had come here several years before him and decided that hunger was the best way to control the world. She knew he was here. The notebook lay by the greenhouse, placed there on purpose, so he would find it, so he would know, so he would understand who he was dealing with. It was a message, not a threat, an invitation. Look what I've done. Try to stop it. Daniel closed the notebook, pressed it to his chest. He stood in the snow and breathed. Steam rose from his mouth and dissolved into the cold morning air. Behind him in the abbey, people were waking up. 200 refugees, his team, 14 villages, 20,000 people, all dependent on the grain he had grown and the knowledge he had passed on.
And somewhere on the continent, a woman in a hood looked at those same fields and saw in them not salvation, but a threat to her plan. And this woman knew everything he knew: genetics, breeding, mycology, plant pathology. She was no less intelligent and no less prepared. She simply decided to use that knowledge in the opposite way. Daniel put the notebook in his inside pocket. He returned to the abbey. He found Lyra. He found Sa'a. He found Cillian, Yuna, and Elza. He gathered them in the hall. He closed the door. He placed the notebook on the table. He opened it. They read. Cillian translated for those who didn't know English. The silence grew thicker with every page. When Cillian finished reading the last entry, the hall was silent. Lyra spoke first. She asked quietly if this meant that more was not divine punishment, but the work of human hands. Daniel nodded. Lyra closed her eyes. Her hands clenched into fists. 2 years ago, her husband had been burned at the stake for trying to save livestock from a disease that someone had deliberately created. He died for the truth, in a world where the truth had been declared heresy. Saya placed her hand on her sword. She asked quietly where this woman was. Daniel said he didn't know, but he would find her. Yuna looked up from her notebook. She said that if the mold was man-made, then it could be destroyed. If it was created, then it has a vulnerability, because everything created has a weakness. Daniel looked at her rice, at his wheat, at Helen Price's notebook. Yuna was right. A man-made organism has a man-made vulnerability. If Helen derived gray mold from fusarium strains, then the key to destroying it might lie in rice genetics. Not just resistance, a suppression mechanism. Elsa sat in silence. Then she stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at the fields, at the white snow over the green greenhouses, at the smoke from the abbey's chimneys, at the road leading south. She said quietly that it didn't matter who did it. What mattered was that now they knew. And now they weren't just feeding people. Now they were stopping the one who wants people to die. Daniel walked over to her. He stood next to her by the window. He looked at the same fields, at the same snow, at the same smoke. A year ago, he had been lying face down in the gray earth, not knowing where he was. Now he was standing in an abbey that fed 20,000 people, with a team he hadn't earned but had been given, with a strain that would become immortal in a single generation, with a secret that explained everything and changed everything. He didn't say it out loud, but the image was before his eyes, that very one. The old woman in the distant village. So many carrots there was no one to give them to. He turned toward the table, toward the team, toward the people who were looking at him and waiting. He said quietly that in the spring they would sow the 5th generation, that by summer there would be Homegrave 1, that by fall every village would receive seeds that could be sown forever. And then they would find Helen Price and end the Gray Sea, not with a sword, not with fire, with grain, because he was an agronomist, and his weapon grew from the earth. The morning sun broke through the window and fell in a golden streak across the table, on the notebook, on their faces, on Elsa's hands in the soil, on Cillian's ink-stained fingers, on the hilt of Sa'a's sword, on Lyra's red palms, on Yuna's notepad. Beyond the abbey walls lay the world, gray, sick, hungry, but no longer hopeless.